I was pushing a mop at midnight when 6 armed men walked into the building. They came for the CEO, her codes, and everything she'd built. What they didn't know, what nobody in that glass tower had ever bothered to find out, was that the quiet man in the gray uniform had once cleared enemy compounds in the dark with nothing but his hands and 12 seconds of nerve. They laughed at the janitor. That was their first mistake. And in this business, the first mistake is usually the last. What? If stories like this speak to you, real human stories about quiet strength, sacrifice, and the people nobody sees coming, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it, because this one is going to stay with you. The floor buffer was broken again. Caleb Donovan noticed it the moment he pulled it from the supply closet on the 32nd floor. A rhythmic grinding in the motor that hadn't been there the week before. He crouched down, examined the underside, and diagnosed the problem in about 4 seconds. A worn belt. Maybe $30 in parts if you ordered generic. He'd mentioned it to facilities twice already. Nothing happened. So he did what he'd always done when an obstacle couldn't be immediately removed. He worked around it. He switched to the mop, added a small amount of the commercial cleaner to the bucket, and started at the far end of the corridor the way he always did, working toward the elevator banks, pushing the grime back section by section, methodical and quiet. The executive floor of Harrington Technologies at 11:15 on a Wednesday night looked exactly the way it always did at that hour. Empty, still, the kind of silence that felt expensive. Caleb didn't mind the quiet. He'd spent enough years in places where quiet meant danger, where a street that went suddenly still meant someone had spotted the convoy. Out here, quiet just meant no one was watching, which was fine. He preferred it. He paused near the windows that looked out over the city, 32 floors of glass and steel, the skyline spreading east toward the river, the lights of cars tracing slow lines across the wet streets below. Rain was coming. He could feel the pressure shift in his left shoulder, where a piece of shrapnel had gone in during an op he was never legally allowed to describe in full detail. The shoulder was his weather system now, more reliable than any app. "Daddy." The voice came from around the corner, small and clear, and very much not supposed to be on the 32nd floor of a corporate building at 11 at night. He stepped around the cleaning cart and found Emma sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the copy machine alcove, her backpack open, her homework spread across the carpet tiles in a radius that suggested either creativity or chaos. Probably both. She was 8. The line in between the two was blurry. "You were supposed to stay in the break room," he said. Not angry, just noting the fact. Emma looked up from her math worksheet. She had her mother's eyes, that clear, steady gaze that made you feel like she was reading something you'd written on the inside of your forehead. "The vending machine is out of the apple juice kind, and it smells like burned popcorn in there. Someone always burns the popcorn in the break room. Why?" "Because they walk away and forget to listen," Caleb said. "Stay where I can see you." He parked the cart near the copy alcove and pulled a folding chair out from the small supply room, setting it beside the machine so Emma had somewhere to put her backpack that wasn't the floor. She accepted this arrangement without comment, which meant she'd been planning to stay there regardless of what he said. He recognized the tactic. He'd used it himself, professionally, for 11 years. Emma Donovan was the single best thing in his life, and she was also, he had come to accept, slightly ungovernable. Not in a broken way. In the way of a kid who had been through more than she should have before the age of 8 and had developed, in response, a bone-deep self-reliance that even her father couldn't always override. She'd watched her mother get sick. She'd watched her mother get sicker. She'd sat in waiting rooms with Caleb while doctors explain things in the careful language that adults use when they don't want to say what they actually mean. She'd been at the hospital the night it ended, and she'd held Caleb's hand in the parking garage afterward without saying a word, because even at 6 years old she'd understood that sometimes there is nothing to say. That had been 2 years ago. The grief was still there. It didn't vanish on any kind of schedule, despite what people implied when they said things like, "She'll bounce back," or "kids are resilient." Emma had her bad nights. So did Caleb. They'd learned to sit with it instead of pretending it wasn't there, which was the most honest thing he'd managed to teach her so far. He moved the mop bucket down the corridor and kept working. The job had come through a Veterans Employment Placement Service 14 months earlier. Caleb had been turned down for 6 other positions before it, private security consultants who wanted references he couldn't legally provide, defense contractors who wanted candidates with active clearances he no longer held, corporate risk management firms that had liked his resume until the interview, when the gap between military service and civilian expectations became too wide to paper over with a firm handshake. He'd done 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He'd run 17 confirmed direct action missions and participated in operations that existed in classified files and buildings he would never be allowed to enter again. None of that translated cleanly to a job description. None of it came with paperwork that could be shown to an HR department. So he mopped floors. The pay was $22 an hour, which sounded like more than it was once you factored in rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where Emma could walk to school safely, the medical bills that were still working their way through the payment plan he'd negotiated with the hospital, $600 a month, and he couldn't afford to miss one, and the small weekly cost of Emma's after-school program, which she attended on the days his schedule didn't allow him to pick her up. On the nights he worked late, she came with him. He'd cleared it quietly with his supervisor, a heavy-set man named Roy, who had 2 kids of his own and had looked the other way without asking too many questions. Roy was a good man. Caleb respected him. Most of the other employees at Harrington Technologies had no opinion about Caleb Donovan at all, which was the natural consequence of being the guy who cleaned up after people. He was furniture. He was the reason the glass by the elevator was always streak-free, and the trash by the shredding station never overflowed. He existed at the edge of the frame, present enough to serve a function, invisible enough not to require acknowledgement. He was used to it. What he was not used to, what still caught him slightly off guard on certain evenings, was the loneliness of it. Not the solitude, which he'd always been comfortable with. The loneliness was different. It was the feeling of standing in a room full of people who spoke a language he partially understood but couldn't quite inhabit. The men and women on the executive floor spoke about market positioning and stakeholder optics and synergy pipelines, and Caleb listened while he emptied wastebaskets and thought about the way those words floated above actual ground-level reality like weather balloons. Not wrong, just very high up. He rounded the corner past the cluster of glass-walled conference rooms and reached the section of the floor that housed the senior executive suites. Most of them were dark. The large corner office at the end, the one with the view that covered 2 full compass points, had its lights on. It almost always did. Audrey Harrington was 30 years old, which was remarkable in the way that almost everything about her was remarkable, quietly, without making a show of it, in a way that you only fully appreciated if you paid attention. She had taken over as CEO of Harrington Technologies 18 months ago, following the death of her father, who had built the company from a 3-person engineering startup into one of the 15 largest technology firms in the country. She'd been the CFO before that. Before that, she'd been in product development. She'd worked every significant function in the company because her father had insisted on it, and she had agreed not because he insisted but because she understood, early, that authority without comprehension was just noise. She was brilliant in the way engineers are brilliant, not performatively, not in the way that needed an audience. She thought in systems. She saw the relationship between variables that other people experienced as separate. She was also, those who worked closely with her would tell you, difficult in the specific way that highly capable people are difficult. She expected from others what she expected from herself, which was more than most people were prepared to give. She was sitting at her desk when Caleb reached the door of her office with the mop bucket, and he gave a light knock on the open frame to announce himself, because she'd told him to do that rather than just walk in, 2 months ago. On the one occasion she'd actually spoken directly to him. She didn't look up from her screen. "Go ahead." He began at the perimeter of the room, working the corners the way he always did, keeping the noise to a minimum. The office smelled like cold coffee and something floral, a candle on the credenza that had burned down to the last half-inch of wax. There were papers everywhere, organized in a way that looked chaotic, and probably wasn't. A whiteboard along the side wall was covered in flow diagrams and abbreviated terms he recognized in some cases and couldn't parse in others. She was working on the merger. Everyone on the floor knew about it, in the way that office populations absorb information through proximity. Fragments of conversations, emails left on screens too long, the specific tension in how people carried themselves when something large was in motion. Harrington Technologies was 10 days out from finalizing a merger with a firm called Meridian Systems, And the deal was worth, according to the number he'd overheard in a hallway, something north of $4 billion. Caleb mopped the floor. Emma appeared in the doorway. He saw it happen, the small figure in the oversized blue hoodie materializing at the edge of his peripheral vision, and turned to redirect her. But Audrey had already looked up, and for a moment the three of them occupied the same space in a kind of accidental tableau, the CEO at her desk, the janitor with the mop, the 8-year-old standing in the doorway with a math worksheet in her hand, and absolutely no awareness that she was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "Hi," Emma said. Audrey blinked. Then, and this was the part Caleb hadn't expected, she smiled. Not the professional, calibrated expression she wore in the corridors. An actual smile, the kind that reached the corners of her eyes and changed her whole face. "Hi," she said. "Who are you?" "Emma, my dad works here. He cleans things." She held up the worksheet. "I'm stuck on fractions." "Emma," Caleb said it quietly, with the particular weight of a parent communicating, "we will discuss this later," without saying the words. "It's fine," Audrey said. She looked at the worksheet across the room. "Which part?" Emma crossed the office like she owned it, that unearned confidence Caleb had never been able to figure out whether to admire or correct, and set the paper on the edge of Audrey's desk. Audrey looked at it, then pulled a pen from the cup beside her keyboard. "You're making it harder than it is," Audrey said. "Fractions are just division wearing different clothes. See this number on the bottom? It's just asking how many pieces you cut the whole thing into. That's it." Emma studied the paper with the focused expression she used when she was actually thinking, rather than just appearing to think. "So, 3/4 means I cut it into 4 pieces, and I have 3 of them?" "Exactly." "That's not that bad." "No," Audrey agreed. "Most things aren't once you see what they're actually asking." Emma picked up her worksheet and looked at Audrey with the uncomplicated assessment of a child deciding whether an adult had passed some private test. Apparently she had, because Emma nodded once and walked back out of the office. Caleb watched his daughter leave, then turned back to find Audrey watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. "How old?" she asked. 8, he said. "Sorry about—" "Don't apologize, she's fine." A pause. "Is it always this late?" "Some nights. My shift runs—" He stopped. She probably didn't need the details of his schedule. "Sometimes." Audrey looked like she was going to say something else. Then her phone buzzed on the desk, and whatever it was went away, replaced by the practiced focus of someone who had learned to redirect attention like a resource. She turned back to her screen. Caleb finished the floor and moved the bucket toward the door. "What's your name?" Audrey asked, not looking up this time. He paused. "Caleb. Caleb Donovan." She nodded, as if filing it somewhere it might actually stay. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Ms. Harrington." He collected Emma from the copy alcove. She had, by some miracle, completed 4 of the 6 worksheet problems, and they took the service elevator down to retrieve the rest of his equipment from the lower supply room. In the elevator, Emma ate the last of the crackers she'd packed in her backpack and leaned against Caleb's arm. "She's smart," Emma said. "She runs the whole company. She explained fractions better than my teacher does." "Don't tell your teacher that." Emma considered this. "Is she nice?" Caleb thought about it honestly. "I don't know her that well." "She seemed nice." The elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened onto the service corridor. Caleb pushed the cart out, and they moved through the quiet back hallways of the building. The part visitors never saw, the loading docks and utility rooms and the long beige corridors that kept the visible machinery of a building running without interrupting the aesthetic of the floors above. He signed out at 11:48, helped Emma into her coat, and walked her to the car. The rain had started while they were inside, a steady, cold curtain of it that bounced off the parking garage concrete and turned the city lights into smears. Emma fell asleep before they reached the on-ramp. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, the wipers going, the radio off. He thought about the floor buffer. He thought about the $600 due to the hospital in 11 days. He thought about the message from Emma's school, asking if he'd be available for a parent-teacher conference on a Thursday afternoon. When he had a shift, he couldn't swap without losing the hours. He thought about his wife, the specific way she'd smelled when he came back from deployment, something clean and warm that took him about 45 minutes to decompress enough to actually notice. He thought about the last time she'd been healthy enough to walk to the car without help, and how he hadn't known at the time that it was the last time, which was the part that still felt like something half-healed that you keep bumping in the dark. He pulled into the apartment complex at 12:31, carried Emma inside without waking her, got her shoes off, and sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes in the dark. The shoulder was hurting, the rain was getting heavier. Tomorrow he had an early shift in addition to the late one, and he'd need to arrange backup pickup for Emma from school because the times overlapped by 40 minutes. None of it was impossible. He'd handled things that were impossible. He went to bed at 1 o'clock, set his alarm for 5:15, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. Old habit. The week that followed passed the way most weeks did for Caleb, in shifts and school pickups, and the careful arithmetic of making a life work on the margins of what was technically possible. He fixed the floor buffer himself on Thursday morning, before his shift officially started. He'd ordered the replacement belt online, $26, standard shipping, arrived in 2 days, and swapped it out in the supply closet in about 12 minutes. He left a note for Roy explaining what he'd done and that facilities might want to look at the secondary motor mount while they were at it. Roy texted back 3 hours later, "Good catch. They never listened to me either." Caleb appreciated that. Roy was the kind of man who said what he meant without ornamentation, which was the kind of person Caleb had always found easiest to trust. Emma had her parent-teacher conference on Thursday afternoon. Caleb managed to rearrange his early shift by arriving 40 minutes ahead of schedule and compressing the East Wing into the time he had, which meant he finished with one men's restroom on the 28th floor, still needing attention. He pulled Roy aside and told him honestly. Roy told him not to worry about it and handled the restroom himself, which Caleb acknowledged with a nod that said more than most people's lengthy expressions of gratitude. The conference itself was at Emma's school, a squat brick building 6 blocks from their apartment that Caleb had chosen carefully based on the test scores, the staff-to-student ratio, and the general condition of the exterior, which told you something about how the administration felt about the place. Emma's teacher was a young woman named Ms. Ford, who wore her hair in a tight bun and spoke with the particular over-enunciated clarity of someone who spent 6 hours a day talking to 8-year-olds and hadn't fully switched it off. "Emma is very sharp," Ms. Ford said, which Caleb already knew. "She grasps concepts quickly. The challenge is that she doesn't always stay interested once she's grasped them. She finishes early and then Ms. Ford paused, choosing her words. "She becomes creative. Creative how?" "She reorganized the classroom library by color last week, during a reading period. The other kids thought it was an improvement." Caleb looked at the desk between them. "I'll talk to her." "It's not a discipline issue," Ms. Ford said quickly. "She's not disruptive. She thinks faster than the pace allows for. Have you considered any enrichment programs?" He had considered them. He'd priced them too. The ones worth considering were $200 to $300 a month for after-school enrollment, which was money that currently existed on paper in the form of debt he was still servicing. "I'm looking into it," he said, which was true, in the sense that he had looked at the cost and understood the gap. Ms. Ford seemed like she wanted to say more and thought better of it. She'd probably been trained to read between the lines of what parents said in conferences. Caleb respected that restraint. He picked Emma up from the after-school program at 5:15. She was sitting on the front steps with her backpack between her feet and a library book open across her knees. She looked up when she heard his truck. "How bad?" she asked, falling into step beside him. "Your teacher likes you." "That's not what I asked." "You reorganized the library during reading period." Emma was quiet for a half block. Then, "The previous system made no sense. That's not the point." "I know," she said. Not defensive, just acknowledging the information. That was another thing about Emma. She could receive a correction without converting it into a wound, which was a skill most adults never fully developed. "I'll ask before I do things like that. That's all I'm asking." She slid her hand into his as they crossed the intersection, the way she still did sometimes, unselfconsciously, without planning it. He held on and didn't mention it, because she was 8, and there were a finite number of years left, where this was something she'd still do. By the following Tuesday, the atmosphere on the 32nd floor had changed in ways Caleb could measure without knowing the specifics. He'd developed the habit of reading rooms. It was less a skill than a survival mechanism he'd built during years of operating in environments where the difference between a normal street and a compromised one was expressed in the microlanguage of posture, eye contact, and the specific quality of a silence. The executive floor of Harrington Technologies had its own version of this. He'd learned it over 14 months, which assistants were stressed versus busy when a meeting had gone badly by how people carried their coffee on the way back from the conference room, whether the day was running long by how many people were still at their desks when he arrived for the late shift. This week was different. The assistants moved faster. The conversations he caught fragments of in hallways were shorter and quieter. The glass-walled conference rooms had been occupied every time he passed them since Sunday, which was unusual. The executive floor rarely held weekend sessions. The whiteboards in two of the smaller rooms had been covered with butcher paper, which was what people did when they didn't want the cleaning staff to accidentally erase something important. Caleb hadn't erased anything important in 14 months, but he understood the instinct. Not everything sensitive was marked clearly from the outside. He learned through proximity, the way he always had. The merger with Meridian Systems was in trouble. That was the shape of it, though the specifics were beyond what he could piece together from overheard fragments. Something had gone sideways in the due diligence process. There was a competitor, a man whose name Caleb caught once, Harlan Drexler, spoken in the corridor by one of Audrey's senior vice presidents with the tonal flatness of someone naming a natural disaster. Drexler ran a firm called Vantage Group, which had been pursuing Meridian for longer than Harrington had and had more money and fewer ethical constraints in how it played the game. Caleb knew the type. He'd operated against equivalents in the field, not corporations, but the underlying calculus was similar. Men who had decided that the rules applied to other people. Men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted because they'd never encountered resistance that held. He filed it away and kept working. On Wednesday evening, the weather turned. A storm system that had been threatening since Monday finally arrived over the city with the full commitment of something that had been building pressure for days. Rain hit the building's exterior glass with a sound like static. The wind at altitude was enough to make the structure sway imperceptibly. Not dangerously, just the designed flexibility of a modern high-rise doing what it was engineered to do, but noticeable if you were paying attention and knew what you were feeling. Caleb was on the 32nd floor at 9:47 p.m. Emma was in the copy alcove again. He'd tried to argue for the break room, but the popcorn situation apparently remained unresolved, and she'd negotiated herself back into the alcove with the logic of someone who had decided the outcome in advance and was simply walking him toward it. He'd brought her a sandwich from the cafeteria on the lower floor, which she'd eaten half of and left wrapped in its paper on top of her backpack, along with an apple she was going to eat eventually and a juice box she'd finished in the elevator. She was doing math. The fractions were going better this week, she'd told him without being asked. She'd figured out the trick. "The one the lady showed you?" Caleb had asked. "Miss Harrington, yeah." He had, at some point in the past week, registered that his daughter had begun thinking of the CEO of Harrington Technologies as the lady who helped with fractions. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he did nothing with it. Emma filed people under what they'd actually done for her, which was probably the most accurate filing system available. The corridor outside Audrey's office was lit up. He could see the light under the door. She'd closed it tonight, which she sometimes did when a call was running long. He worked the far end of the floor first, giving her the space. He'd circled back toward the executive suites around 10:20 when he heard her voice through the door. Not the content of the conversation, just the cadence of it. Short, clipped responses. The rhythm of someone listening to something bad and choosing their words with precision. He moved past the door without stopping. At 10:38, the elevator at the end of the corridor dinged. Caleb didn't turn immediately. People sometimes worked late in other departments and came up to use the executive floor copier when their own floors were locked down. He kept moving the mop through its arc, tracking the sound through his peripheral awareness the way he'd learned to track everything: present, logged, assessed, filed. 4 sets of footsteps, not the loose, uncoordinated sound of office workers. These were measured, deliberate. The kind of footfall that comes from people who've been trained to move in a particular way and never fully stop moving that way. He turned. 4 men came off the elevator. They were dressed in dark clothing, not uniforms, but practical, layered, the kind of gear that had too many pockets and no logos. One of them was carrying what looked from a distance like a long equipment case, the kind used for audio-visual gear. The other three had nothing visible in their hands, which was its own kind of information. Their eyes moved across the corridor in a sweep pattern, quick, systematic, moving from anchor point to anchor point, not office workers. Caleb stopped the mop. He set it gently against the wall so it didn't make a sound hitting the baseboard. His right hand rested on top of the mop bucket handle, relaxed. His weight shifted slightly forward on the balls of his feet. None of this was visible unless you knew what you were looking at. The man at the front of the group met his eyes briefly and nodded. The casual acknowledgement of someone passing the help in a corridor. Caleb nodded back. He watched them move toward the east end of the floor, away from where Audrey's office was, toward the secondary conference rooms. He waited 45 seconds. Then he walked to the end of the corridor and looked. The men had entered the large conference room, the one that was used for full board presentations and had its own private server rack along the back wall for secure teleconferencing. Through the glass, Caleb watched one of them open the equipment case. It wasn't audio-visual equipment. He turned around and walked back toward the supply closet, his pace unchanged. He went inside, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, and called Roy. Roy answered on the third ring, voice thick with someone who'd been watching television. "Yeah. You log any contractors coming in tonight? Conference room build-out, AV work, anything like that?" A pause. "No. Nothing tonight. Why?" 4 men just came off 32 with an equipment case. They went into the Meridian room. A longer pause. Roy had been in facilities for 22 years. He knew exactly what was and wasn't scheduled. "I'm calling security." "Do that. Send them to the East Conference Cluster." Caleb ended the call. He stood in the supply closet for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the mop handles and the shelves of cleaning solution and the broken floor buffer that he'd fixed last week with a $26 belt. He thought about Emma in the copy alcove. He thought about where the supply closet put him in relation to the East Conference Room and Audrey's office. He thought about the equipment case. Then he walked back out into the corridor. He went to the copy alcove first. Emma looked up from her worksheet. "Okay," Caleb said. "I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" She read something in his face and put down her pencil. "Yes." "I need you to take your backpack, go into this supply closet here." He pointed to the narrow one behind the alcove, the one full of printer cartridges and copy paper. "And close the door. Sit on the floor. Do not come out until I come and get you. Not for any sound you hear. Not if someone knocks on that door unless it's me." Emma didn't ask questions. This was one of the things about her. She'd learned, somewhere along the way, to distinguish between her father being cautious, careful, and her father being serious, serious. She grabbed her backpack, stood up, and looked at him for just a second. "Are you okay?" "I'm going to be," he said. "Closet. Now." She went. He heard the door click shut. He moved down the corridor. The building's secondary power chose that exact moment to do something it shouldn't have done. The lights on the executive floor went off. Not flickered, went off completely, the way power goes when something cuts it deliberately rather than when a breaker trips. The emergency lighting clicked on 4 seconds later. The low amber strips along the baseboard, designed to provide enough illumination for evacuation, not enough for much else. The building's central alarm system, which should have registered the power interruption and activated within those 4 seconds, made a brief chirping sound and then went silent. Someone had cut the primary circuit and jammed the backup alert system. Caleb flattened himself against the wall in the amber half-dark and stopped moving. He listened. From the east end of the floor, through the conference room glass, he could see flashlight beams moving. The men had been prepared for the power cut. They'd caused it. From behind him, further toward the elevator bank, a new sound. Not from the elevator. From the stairwell. The door opened with the specific metallic resonance of a fire door being pushed from below, the pressure differential making a sound that was different from someone pushing it from the floor level. Someone was coming up from beneath. More than one person. The stairwell door on the west end of the floor. He moved. He reached the edge of the executive suite corridor and pressed himself into the doorway recession of a dark office, watching the stairwell door across the lobby space. It opened. 2 more men came through, and these 2 were not dressed for ambiguity. They moved with weapons visible, held at a low ready, scanning the dim corridor with handheld tactical lights. Behind them came a third man who moved differently from the rest, unhurried, upright, with the particular confidence of someone who gives orders and waits for results. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy-set, wearing a dark coat that was too expensive for what was happening around him. Caleb had seen that posture before. That was a man accustomed to buying whatever problem he needed solved. The three of them moved toward the lit seam under Audrey's office door. The man in the expensive coat raised one hand, and one of the armed men ahead of him stepped forward and pushed Audrey's office door open without knocking. Caleb heard Audrey's voice, sharp and immediate. "What the—" Then the second armed man entered the office, and the door swung mostly shut behind them. From the east end of the corridor, the four original men had emerged from the conference room. Two of them moved toward the server room adjacent to Audrey's suite. One stayed at the conference room door. The last one turned and began walking the corridor in Caleb's direction, sweeping for loose variables. Caleb had, at most, 30 seconds before that man reached the office doorway he was standing in. He thought about the building's layout, which he knew the way he knew all the buildings he worked in. Not because he'd studied it, but because 14 months of cleaning every corridor on every shift had deposited the architecture into the part of his memory that stored things he might need. He knew where the breaker subpanel for the executive floor was. He knew the service corridor behind the main hall. He knew which conference room had a connecting door to the adjacent one that most people didn't use because it jammed from the inside and you had to know how to lift the handle. He knew where the fire suppression system controls were for this floor. He knew where the emergency defibrillator cabinet was mounted on the wall near the elevator, and he knew that the cabinet was metal and weighed approximately 11 pounds and was mounted at a height that put it exactly at the reach of his right hand from where he was currently standing. The man sweeping the corridor was 20 seconds away. Caleb reached up and unlatched the defibrillator cabinet as quietly as the old hinges allowed. He waited. 15 seconds. 10. The footsteps slowed near the lobby space. The tactical light swept right, then began to swing left. Caleb moved out of the doorway in one single motion, covered the distance in 3 steps, and hit the man across the throat with the flat of his forearm. Not the cabinet, not a weapon, just his own body used with precision and controlled force, the way you apply a tool rather than the way you throw a punch in a parking lot. The man's light went wide and down. Caleb caught him before he hit the floor, which would have made too much noise, and dragged him into the dark office and pushed him under the desk. He'd be unconscious for 4 to 6 minutes and have a bad headache afterward. No lasting damage. Caleb picked up the man's tactical light and turned it off. He held still and listened. The corridor was quiet except for the muffled sounds from Audrey's office. He moved to the edge of the lobby space and looked toward her door. Through the gap, could see a strip of interior, the edge of her desk, the glow of a laptop screen still open, and the shape of Audrey Harrington sitting very still in her chair with a man standing 2 feet from her, holding something at his side that caught the ambient light in a way that told Caleb exactly what it was. From inside the office, the man in the expensive coat spoke. His voice was composed, conversational, almost pleasant, which was the most dangerous version of a person in that situation. "Ms. Harrington, I want you to understand that this is a simple transaction. You have access codes for the Meridian data infrastructure. My clients need those codes before the merger closes. You give me the codes, and everyone in this building goes home without a problem." Audrey said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not fearless. The fear was there, it was just not winning. "Who sent you?" "That's not relevant." "Harlan Drexler," she said. It wasn't a question. The man in the coat paused in a way that confirmed it without saying anything. "You understand," Audrey said, "that if you take those codes and sell them to Vantage, you're not disrupting a merger. You're committing 17 separate violations of federal trade law." "Ms. Harrington." "I'm not stalling," she said. "I genuinely don't think you've thought through what happens after, to you personally." "The codes," the man said. The pleasantness had left his voice. Caleb had heard enough. He took stock of what he had. The tactical light, which he wasn't going to turn on. The defibrillator cabinet, still in his left hand. His own body, which was a tool he knew how to use. The layout of the corridor, which he just mapped in real time. The position of the man standing guard at the far conference room, visible through the glass wall from this angle, 30 feet away, facing the other direction. The 2 men who'd gone into the server room, whose position he didn't have but could calculate based on timing. The man in Audrey's office with the weapon, and the man in the expensive coat. 6 people total, not counting the one under the desk. 5 variables. He thought about Emma in the supply closet. He thought about Roy, who had called security and who knew something was wrong on the 32nd floor. Security response time in this building, at this hour, with the elevator system running normally, was 3 to 4 minutes. He'd been watching the floor for roughly 4 minutes since the power went out, which meant the window was now, or he was waiting for backup, and waiting meant Audrey sat in that chair with a man holding a weapon 2 feet from her for another unknown stretch of time. He stopped waiting. He moved to the service corridor door, pushed through it quietly, and traveled the back route to the server room access panel, a door that connected the service corridor to the secondary entrance of the server room, used by IT maintenance and essentially never by anyone else. He came through it with the cabinet in his hand and found the 2 men with their backs to the door, crouched in front of an open rack, running a device off a drive that was plugged directly into the infrastructure. The first man turned at the sound of the door and opened his mouth. Caleb hit him once, precisely, at the junction of the neck and shoulder, in the way that produces immediate unconsciousness without lasting damage, if you hit the right cluster of nerves and know what you're doing. He knew what he was doing. The man went down. The second man spun and grabbed for the firearm at his hip. Caleb stepped inside the reach, took the man's wrist, redirected the motion so that the weapon came free, and put the man into the equipment rack with controlled force. The rack absorbed the impact. The man slumped. Caleb removed the drive from the infrastructure port, pocketed it, and ejected the device they'd been running, 2 down. He moved back through the service corridor. The man at the conference room was the next variable, closest to the stairwell, most likely to reach the evacuation route first. Caleb came out of the service corridor at the far end of the lobby, circled wide behind the glass wall, and came up behind the man from an angle the glass itself had blocked. He used the wall and the man's own posture to resolve the situation in approximately 4 seconds. 3 down. He stopped. Listened. The sounds from Audrey's office were still there, the man in the coat's voice, lower now, no longer conversational. She was still talking to him, holding the conversation. Caleb didn't know if she was doing it on purpose or just because she was the kind of person who talked through fear. Either way, it was helping him. He went to the office door. He pushed it open. The man with the weapon turned first. His instinct was correct, but his training had gaps because he turned and raised the weapon in the same motion, which meant his center of gravity was moving in 2 directions at once. Caleb stepped left, not right, where the man was expecting movement, and the gap between the weapon clearing leather and finding a target was roughly 0.4 seconds. Caleb used that gap. He controlled the weapon hand, applied a specific pressure to the wrist that made holding on to anything impossible, and the weapon landed on the carpet rather than going off, which was the exact outcome he needed. The man was larger than Caleb and recovered faster than he'd have liked. He came back with his elbow, trained response, not bad, and caught Caleb across the cheekbone. It hurt. Caleb let it hurt and didn't let the hurt do anything. He planted his weight, used the man's own forward momentum, and put him into the side of the desk. The desk was solid oak. The man didn't get up again. Caleb turned. The man in the expensive coat had moved to the window, instinctively backing away from what had just happened, which was the response of a man who hired other people to do violence and was now standing in a room alone with the consequences of that arrangement. He had his phone out and was staring at Caleb with an expression Caleb had seen before. The specific look of someone recalculating from a position they'd thought was entirely safe. "Put the phone down," Caleb said. His voice was even, not loud. He wasn't breathing hard. The man put the phone down, slowly, on the edge of Audrey's desk. Audrey Harrington was on her feet, standing behind her chair with both hands pressed flat on the desk. She was looking at Caleb, at the man in the gray cleaning uniform who had just put 2 people on the floor in her office, and the expression on her face was the closest thing to pure disorientation that he'd seen on anyone in a professional context. "Are you—" she started. "I'm fine," Caleb said. He looked at the man in the coat. "Sit down in that chair. Keep your hands on the arms." The man sat. His expensive coat was slightly askew. He sat very still. Caleb reached for the office phone on the desk without taking his eyes off the man. He picked it up and set it in front of Audrey. "Call 911. Tell them you have corporate intruders, multiple individuals, executive floor. Building is 32 stories. Main entrance on Commerce. Tell them you have one person detained in the office and several others incapacitated on the floor." Audrey picked up the phone. He watched her hands. They were shaking slightly. Not badly, the fine tremor of adrenaline being managed rather than surrendered to. She started talking to the dispatcher. Caleb walked back to the doorway and looked down the corridor. The amber emergency lighting painted everything in dull gold. The building was quiet except for the rain against the exterior glass and the distant sound of wind around the structure. He thought about Emma. He walked quickly to the copy alcove, knocked on the supply closet door with 2 sharp taps. A pause. 2 taps back from inside. He unlocked the door and opened it. Emma was sitting on a box of copy paper with her backpack in her lap, her math worksheet folded into quarters in her hand, her expression composed in the way of someone who had been scared and had sat with it long enough that it had become something more manageable. She looked at his face, at the mark on his cheekbone where the man's elbow had connected, and her mouth tightened. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm fine." He crouched down to her level. "I need you to stay right here a little longer. There are going to be police coming in a few minutes. When you hear them, you can come out." "Are you going back?" "Yeah." Emma looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said, and then, with a gravity that made her sound older than 8, "Be careful." He closed the closet door gently and walked back down the corridor. The man in the expensive coat was still in the chair. Audrey was still on the phone. From somewhere below, distantly, came the first pulse of a police siren threading up through the rain and the night. Caleb stood in the doorway of the office and waited, his hands loose at his sides, the cheekbone aching in the way that meant it was going to look worse in the morning than it felt now. He didn't try to explain anything to the man in the chair. He didn't say anything to Audrey. He just stood there in the amber light with rain streaking the windows behind the city skyline, and he listened to the sirens get closer, and he thought about the drive he'd pocketed from the server room and what it probably contained, and whether Roy had managed to get through to building security, and whether Emma had enough of her sandwich left for the ride home. The sirens were very close now. Downstairs, the lobby doors were about to open. The first officers through the stairwell door were moving fast and loud, in the way that police move when they know something has already happened and don't yet know how much of it. 2 of them swept the lobby space with their flashlights, calling out clearance signals to each other, their voices tight and professional. Behind them came 2 more, then a 5th who moved differently from the others, older, heavier through the chest, with the deliberate pace of someone whose job was to assess rather than respond. Caleb stepped out of the doorway of Audrey's office with his hands visible and his palms open, which was the only language that mattered in the next 30 seconds. "Hands, now!" The nearest officer had his weapon up and his light directly in Caleb's face. "My hands are open," Caleb said, keeping his voice flat and calm. "I work here. I'm the one who called this in through building security. There are 5 individuals incapacitated on this floor. 1 in the office behind me, 2 in the server room through the service corridor, 1 in the East Conference Room area, 1 in a dark office near the lobby. None of them are going anywhere. There's a child in the supply closet behind the copy machine alcove at the north end of the corridor. She's unhurt. Her name is Emma." The officer didn't lower his weapon immediately, which was correct procedure, and Caleb didn't hold it against him. "You're the one who did this?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." A pause in which the officer made a series of rapid evaluations. The man in gray cleaning clothes with open hands and a bruise forming on his left cheekbone, who had apparently, in the last 15 minutes, neutralized 5 trained operatives on a corporate executive floor. The math was difficult, but the evidence was right there in the corridor. Down on your knees, hands behind your head. This is procedure, not accusation. Understood. Caleb went down without argument. He'd done this before in the field, on the other side of it, cuffing people who'd just done violent, necessary things for complicated reasons. He knew the protocol was the protocol, and that the ground was cold, and that none of it was personal. The officer cuffed him. Another officer entered Audrey's office. Caleb heard the sound of the man in the expensive coat being brought to his feet and told not to move. Then he heard Audrey's voice, clear and carrying. "The man you just cuffed is not a suspect. He's the reason anyone in this building is still breathing." The officer behind Caleb didn't uncuff him immediately. Standard. "Ma'am, I need you to stay." "I am staying," Audrey said. I'm staying, and I'm telling you that man on the floor kept 6 armed intruders from stealing classified data and held this floor until you got here. I watched him do it. Take the cuffs off him." Another pause. The older officer, the one who'd entered last, moved through the lobby space and crouched down in front of Caleb at eye level. He had a wide, worn face and close-cropped gray hair and eyes that moved across Caleb's face the way eyes do when they're reading something rather than just looking. He studied him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "What's your name, son?" "Caleb Donovan." The older man's expression shifted, not dramatically. A small recalibration behind the eyes, the way a face moves when a piece of information connects to something already stored. He straightened up and looked at the officer behind Caleb. "Take those off, right now." The cuffs came off. Caleb stood up, rolling his wrists once. The cheekbone was definitely worse than it had felt, a hot, tight pressure behind the eye that meant the morning was going to be uncomfortable. He looked at the older officer. "You have 3 men in the server room area. The service corridor connects directly behind the conference suite. They were running a data extraction device off the primary infrastructure rack. I pulled the drive. It's in my right jacket pocket. You'll want to log that as evidence immediately." The officer looked at him for another second. "How do you know that?" "Because I know what they were doing and why. The drive has the Meridian System's proprietary data architecture on it. That's what they came for. And you know this because I work this floor every night and I pay attention." The officer absorbed this. He gave a quiet order to one of the younger officers to follow Caleb's directions to the server room. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card, which he held without offering. "I'm going to want a full statement from you tonight. That going to be a problem?" "No?" "Good." He offered the card. "Detective Nathan Cross. I run the commercial crimes unit, but I caught this call because of the flag on the Harrington building. We've had surveillance concerns about this address for 3 weeks. He paused. "Donovan, you were in the service." It wasn't a question. Caleb took the card. "Navy." "How long?" 11 years. Cross looked at him the way people look at something that's slightly further away than they thought. Then he nodded, once, in the way of a man who'd served himself and was acknowledging something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Go check on your kid," he said. "Don't leave the building." Emma came out of the supply closet holding her backpack with both hands and her math worksheet still folded in her jacket pocket. And when she saw Caleb, she walked directly to him and pressed her face against his chest without saying anything. He put his arm around her and held on. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a moment, very still, letting the closet-sized fear decompress into something larger and therefore less concentrated. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah." Her voice was muffled against his shirt. "Your cheek looks bad." "It'll be fine." "It's purple." "I know." She stepped back and looked up at him with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. She said it. "Did you hurt them?" Caleb considered the honest answer. "I stopped them from hurting anyone else." Emma absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's not the same as my question." "No," he said. "It's not. Nobody's dead, if that's what you're asking. Some of them are going to have headaches." She nodded. That was apparently the information she needed, because she pulled her backpack up on her shoulder and looked around the corridor at the officers moving through the space. "Are we in trouble?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." She accepted this and didn't push it further, which was a mercy, because the full honest answer would have taken longer than he had energy for at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, with a bruised cheekbone and an adrenaline metabolization headache building behind his left eye. One of the younger officers came over and crouched to Emma's level. "Hi there, are you Emma?" Emma regarded him carefully. "Yes." "Are you okay? You want some water? We've got water downstairs." "I'm okay." She paused. "Is the vending machine in the lobby? The one by security?" The officer blinked. "I think so." "Does it have apple juice? The good kind, not the watered-down kind?" I'm not sure, honestly." Emma looked at Caleb. "Can we check after?" "Sure," he said. "After." The next 3 hours were the particular grind of official process. Statements, documentation, the careful reconstruction of a sequence of events for people who needed it, rendered in language that fit their forms. Caleb sat across from Detective Cross in the building's security office on the 4th floor, which smelled like old carpet and the particular institutional coffee that every law enforcement adjacent space in America seemed to operate on as a baseline. Cross had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the manner of someone who knew how to listen without performing listening. Caleb told him what had happened in the order it had happened. He didn't dramatize it or minimize it. He described the men, their equipment, the sequence of his movements, the specific decisions he'd made, and the reasoning behind each one. Cross wrote steadily and occasionally asked a clarifying question. He was a good interviewer. He let silences exist rather than filling them, which meant Caleb told him more than a more aggressive interviewer would have extracted. At one point, Cross set down his pen and looked at him directly. "Walk me through the first contact, the man in the lobby corridor. You took him down without a weapon." "Correct." "How?" "Pressure to the vagus nerve cluster. It's a specific technique. You have to know exactly where to apply it and how much force." "And you know that from your service?" "From my service and from 14 months of staying current." Cross looked at him. "Staying current." "I run. I train. I keep the physical skills maintained. A lot of veterans don't." "I have a daughter," Caleb said, as if that explained everything. Which it did. Cross looked at him for a moment and then wrote something on the pad. "The man in the coat, Vincent Mara. That name mean anything to you?" Caleb shook his head. "No, I knew the type. I didn't know him specifically. He's a fixer, high-end, corporate. He's been connected, not charged, connected, to 3 separate incidents of industrial espionage in the past 6 years. This would have been the 4th. Cross tapped his pen against the pad. "The man running this was Harlan Drexler, head of Vantage Group. He retained Mara through 2 intermediary shell companies. We've been building a case on him for 8 months. He uses Mara to keep his hands clean. Used to." Cross allowed himself a small, tight expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "Mara started talking about 40 minutes ago. That's off the record for now, but I want you to understand the scope of what you walked into tonight." Caleb looked at the coffee cup in front of him. It was cold. "The drive I pulled from the rack." "Evidence." "Yes, your instinct was right. That drive would have contained the proprietary architecture for the Meridian merger terms. If Drexler had gotten it before close, he could have used it to undercut the deal, redirect Meridian's board, and potentially acquire the company for significantly less than its actual value." Cross leaned back in his chair. $4 billion, more or less. Caleb said nothing. "You pulled a $26 belt out of a floor buffer last week," Cross said. "Tonight you probably saved a $4 billion merger and 5 people's lives, including the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country." He paused. "How does that math feel from where you're sitting?" "I don't think about it in those terms," Caleb said. "What terms do you think about it in?" Caleb looked at the wall. Emma was in that building. Cross picked up his pen again. "Right," he said quietly. "Right. What?" Audrey Harrington gave her statement in the building's small conference room on the 2nd floor, with her general counsel present and a cup of tea that she hadn't touched. When the officer who'd taken her statement excused himself briefly, she sat alone with the still untouched tea and the yellow legal pad covered in questions she'd answered, and she looked at the wall and tried to make the last 2 hours cohere into something she could hold in both hands and examine. The quiet janitor. The man who told her good night through a half-closed office door twice a week for the better part of a year, whose name she'd asked once and promptly filed under people I should probably know better, and then not acted on it the way she didn't act on dozens of small social corrections that got buried under the actual work of running a company. That man had walked through 5 armed professionals in the dark like he was following a route he'd already mapped, and had been standing in her doorway with his hands loose and his breathing even when the police arrived, 12 minutes after the power cut. 12 minutes. She'd checked the timestamp on her 911 call. She kept arriving at the same point and then going past it. She had not known his name 2 weeks ago. She'd had to ask. The man who had just done what she watched him do tonight, and she had not known his name. Her general counsel, a trim, careful man named Howard Park, who'd been with the company for 7 years, came back into the room with his own coffee and sat across from her. He looked at her face and didn't say anything for a moment. The data extraction device had been running for approximately 4 minutes when Donovan interrupted it, he said finally, and the careful way he delivered information he'd had time to process. Ide is looking at what was accessed. Preliminary read is that the core architecture files were queued, but the transfer wasn't complete. We may have gotten lucky. We didn't get lucky, Audrey said. Someone made a decision. Howard looked at her. Yes, he said. Someone did. She picked up the tea and put it down again without drinking it. Where is he now? Donovan, security office, 4th floor, still in with Detective Cross, from what I understand. And the girl? Howard's expression shifted slightly. She's with one of the female officers. They found her some apple juice, I think. Audrey looked at the table. She was in the building. His daughter was in the building. I know. He brought her because he couldn't leave her alone. She said it quietly, not to Howard, more to the fact itself. He was here cleaning floors at 11 at night with his 8-year-old daughter doing homework by the copier because he couldn't afford, because the shift. She stopped. Started again. How long has he worked here? 14 months, according to HR. 14 months. She sat with that. I asked him his name once. 2 weeks ago. Howard didn't offer her absolution or redirect. He was good at that, knowing when to let a person sit in the discomfort of something without rushing her out of it. I want to talk to him tonight, Audrey said, before he leaves the building. Audrey, I know what you're going to say. The lawyers are going to want Howard. She looked at him directly. That man's daughter was hiding in a supply closet for 12 minutes while he cleared 5 armed people off this floor, alone, without anyone asking him to. I'm going to talk to him. Whatever the lawyers want can happen in the morning. Howard nodded. He knew when to stop. Caleb was finishing his written statement. Cross had asked him to write it out in addition to the oral version, which was standard, when there was a knock at the security office door. One of the officers opened it. He heard a brief exchange. Then the officer looked at Caleb with a slightly uncertain expression. Ms. Harrington is asking to speak with you. Outside. Caleb capped the pen and set it down. He looked at Cross. Cross shrugged. I've got what I need from you for tonight. Don't leave the city, obviously. I'll be in touch tomorrow. He paused. Get some ice on that cheek. Caleb went out. Audrey was in the corridor outside the security office, which was a narrow beige hallway that was nothing like the executive floor. Fluorescent lighting, industrial carpet, the smell of the building's infrastructure doing the less glamorous parts of its job. She was still in the clothes she'd been wearing when the power went out, a dark blazer over a gray shirt, her hair slightly disarranged in the way of someone who'd been through something and hadn't had a moment to address the small physical consequences of it. She looked, Caleb thought, more like a real person than she usually did on the executive floor, which was probably unfair. The executive floor version was also a real person. She just had more scaffolding around her up there. She looked at his cheek first, then met his eyes. How bad is it? She asked. Cosmetic. I've had worse. She almost said something light in response to that, and then seemed to decide against it. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since you were standing in my doorway, and I haven't come up with anything that doesn't sound completely inadequate. You don't have to say anything. I know I don't have to. She said it without sharpness. I want to. She stopped, looked at the wall briefly, then back at him. I asked you your name 2 weeks ago. Before tonight, that was the only real conversation we'd ever had. You run a company, Caleb said. There's a lot of people. That's a generous way to frame it. He didn't argue the point. She looked at him steadily. You're former military. Navy, SEAL program, 11 years. Something crossed her face, a rapid reassessment of things she'd understood as separate that were now connecting. And you're working here because it was available and it paid. He said it without apology. I have a daughter and medical bills, and I needed to be home at a regular hour. The shift works. Audrey was quiet for a moment. I know about the medical bills, she said. Not the specifics, the fact of them. HR has a record of the payment plan you're on with Memorial Hospital. Standard information in the employee file. She looked slightly uncomfortable saying it, which told him she understood the line she was near. I'm not trying to make you feel surveilled. I'm trying to explain that She stopped again. You didn't know, Caleb said. No, I didn't, and I should have. She said it plainly, without the performance of remorse that would have made it easier to dismiss. Not me personally, maybe, but the company should have. We have people working this building we have a veteran on staff who's on a payment plan with a hospital and bringing his daughter in at night because the shift runs late, and nobody, she pressed her lips together. Nobody noticed. A lot of people don't. I know, she said. That's what I'm saying. I know. And I'm sitting here tonight thinking about your daughter in a supply closet while you were doing what you were doing, and she exhaled. I don't know what the right thing to say is. I just know I wanted to say something rather than let you walk out of this building tonight without me having tried. Caleb looked at her for a moment. She wasn't performing this. He'd been in enough rooms with enough people to know the difference between someone trying to appear a certain way and someone actually feeling their way through an unfamiliar situation. Emma thinks you're good at fractions, he said. Audrey laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, the kind of laugh that doesn't have any performance in it, the kind that happens when something catches you off guard in the best way. She told you that? She said you explained it better than her teacher. That's probably not true. Emma's not generous with compliments. Audrey smiled. Then the smile settled into something more serious but not heavy. Is she okay? Tonight? She's fine. She handled it better than most adults would have. She's your daughter, Audrey said, as though that explained it. And maybe it did. Footsteps came down the corridor. Emma, escorted by the young officer, holding a half-consumed apple juice box with the particular satisfaction of a person who'd solved a logistical problem they'd been thinking about since earlier in the evening. She stopped when she saw Audrey, looked at her father, looked at Audrey. Hi, Emma said. Hi, Emma. Audrey's voice was different than it was in the corridor upstairs. Softer, but not condescending. I heard you were very brave tonight. Emma considered this. I stayed in the closet. That's not that brave. Sometimes staying somewhere and doing nothing when everything in you wants to move is the hardest kind of brave there is. Emma looked at her with the clear-eyed assessment she'd used on the fraction explanation. Decided something internally. Your office is nice, she said. You have a good view. Thank you. I'll show it to you properly sometime, during the day when you can actually see the river. Emma looked at her father. She can do that? It's her building, Caleb said. Oh. Emma processed this. Okay. She took a pull of the apple juice and looked between the two adults with the expression of someone who'd noted something and cataloged it for later review. Caleb looked at Audrey. We should get going. It's late. Of course. She stepped back slightly. Then, Caleb. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Thank you. I'm going to find a better way to say that. But tonight, that's what I have. Get some sleep, he said. You've got a merger to close. She looked at him. Apparently. He walked Emma to the elevator. The young officer said goodnight. The doors opened and they stepped in. As the doors began to close, Caleb caught a last glimpse of Audrey Harrington in the fluorescent corridor, still standing where he'd left her, looking at the space where they'd been, her arms crossed against her chest, in the way of someone standing in a current and deciding which way to lean. The doors closed. Emma leaned against the elevator wall and drank the rest of her apple juice. She remembered my name, she said. You told her your name. Still, Emma looked at the juice box. Most adults forget right away. Caleb watched the floor numbers count down. She seems like someone who tries to remember things. Yeah, Emma said. I think so too. They drove home in the rain. Emma fell asleep before the highway, the same as always, her head against the door, the apple juice box still in her hand. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel and the wipers going, watching the wet road ahead. His shoulder was telling him the rain wasn't going to let up before morning. His cheek was telling him he needed ice and about 10 hours of sleep, neither of which was going to happen in the proportion required. He thought about the drive in his jacket pocket, now logged as evidence in a detective's case file. He thought about Vincent Mara talking to investigators 40 minutes after his people had been put on the floor by a janitor in a gray uniform. He thought about Harlan Drexler, somewhere in the city tonight, and the feeling a man like that must have when a plan that cost him a significant amount of money and several hired professionals fell apart in 12 minutes because of a person he'd never considered a variable. He thought about the floor buffer, the $26 belt, the note he'd left for Roy. He thought about Audrey in the fluorescent corridor saying thank you with the directness of someone who understood that the word was insufficient and was offering it anyway because honesty was worth more than scale. He pulled off the highway and into the neighborhood. The apartment complex came up on the left. He turned in, parked, sat in the car for a moment while Emma slept against the door. The rain came down steady and even on the roof of the cab. He got out, went around to Emma's side, got her door open without waking her, got her bag over his shoulder, lifted her out with both arms, the way he'd done since she was small enough to sleep through it, carried her up the stairs, got the door open, got her inside and onto the couch. Since getting her to the bedroom would require more maneuvering than his cheekbone was interested in facilitating right now. He got her shoes off, pulled the blanket from the back of the couch over her. He went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water and put his wrist under it because he didn't have an ice pack, and the cool helped with the cheekbone. He stood there for a while. On the counter beside the refrigerator was a photograph, 4x6, framed in the simple black frame Emma had picked out from a drugstore display 2 Christmases ago. In it, Caleb and Emma and a woman with clear, steady eyes were standing in front of something. A lake, a summer lake, the water behind them flat and silver in the afternoon light. All 3 of them were slightly out of focus in the way of candid photos where nobody knew the picture was being taken. The woman was laughing at something off to the left. Emma was looking up at her father. Caleb was looking at both of them. He stood at the sink and looked at the photograph and listened to the rain. Then he turned off the kitchen light and sat down in the chair by the window that faced the street, the one he always sat in when he couldn't sleep and didn't want to be in the bedroom. He sat and watched the water run off the gutters into the drain below and listened to Emma's breathing from the couch. Steady, even. The breathing of a kid who'd been scared and sat with it and come out the other side. His phone buzzed on the windowsill. A text from Roy. Heard what happened. You okay? He typed back. Yeah, thanks for calling it in fast. Roy, are you kidding? You neutralized 5 armed guys with a mop bucket and a defibrillator cabinet. Caleb, I didn't use the mop bucket. Roy, I'm going to tell people you used the mop bucket. Caleb looked at his phone for a moment. Roy, seriously though, you good? Caleb, I'm good. Emma's good. That's what matters. He put the phone face down on the sill and went back to watching the rain. By the time the storm started to ease toward 4 in the morning, lightening from black to the dark gray that meant the city was beginning to think about morning, Caleb had been sitting in the chair for 2 hours. He hadn't slept. He hadn't particularly tried. There were nights when the body needed to process things that sleep would have interrupted, and this was one of them. He sat and let the adrenaline work its way fully out of his system, let the headache peak and start to recede, let the cheekbone settle into a steady, manageable throb. At 4:15 he got up, went to the kitchen, and made a sandwich. He ate it standing at the counter. He looked at the photograph. He thought about Emma telling Audrey Harrington that she stayed quiet in the closet because she trusted him to handle it. He thought about what it meant to be trusted that completely by another person, and how that was both the best thing he'd ever done and the most terrifying thing he lived with. He wrapped the second half of the sandwich, put it in the refrigerator, went to the couch, looked at Emma for a moment, pulled the blanket up an inch. Then he went to his room, lay down on top of the covers with his phone on the nightstand, and was asleep within 5 minutes. Old habit. The alarm was set for 7:15. He'd deal with everything that was coming after that. The alarm went off at 7:15 and Caleb silenced it before the second pulse, the way he always did. A reflex so deeply ingrained that his hand was moving before his eyes fully opened. He lay still for 30 seconds, running the inventory. Cheekbone. Tender, swollen, the skin tight in a way that meant it had gone purple overnight the way he'd expected. Left shoulder. The usual morning stiffness that cold weather made worse, aggravated by the previous night's activity. Everything else? Functional. He'd been hurt worse and operated for longer afterward. This was manageable. He got up, went to the bathroom, looked at his face in the mirror. The bruise ran from just below his left eye to the upper ridge of his cheekbone, dark purple shading to yellow-green at the edges, which meant the impact had spread rather than concentrating, which was actually better structurally. Nothing broken. He pressed 2 fingers carefully against the bone and confirmed what he already suspected: cosmetic damage. Painful, not dangerous. He ran the shower cold for 90 seconds before turning it warm, a habit from training that he'd never dropped because it worked. Emma was awake when he came out, sitting up on the couch with the blanket around her shoulders and her math worksheet from the night before, examining it with the expression of someone reviewing a document from a previous life. She looked up at him, looked at his cheek, looked back at the worksheet. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Some." "A lot or some?" "Some." She folded the worksheet and put it in her backpack, which was exactly where her priorities were. School was school. "I'm going to be late," she said, not accusatorially, just stating the logistical fact. "I know. I'll write you a note." He made her toast and eggs while she changed in the bathroom. She came out in a different outfit than the one she'd slept in. Blue jeans and the red hoodie she wore when she wanted to feel normal, which Caleb had noticed was its function without her ever saying so. She ate standing at the counter, reading the back of the cereal box the way she always did when she was using the mundane to reset after something that wasn't mundane. He let her do it. Some people needed noise after a hard thing. Emma needed ordinary surfaces to press her palms against until the hard thing found its proper proportion. He drove her to school, wrote the note at the front desk. "Emma Donovan, late arrival, family matter, please excuse," and watched her walk down the hallway toward her classroom with her backpack on and her shoulders level. She didn't look back. That was its own kind of information. She was okay. She didn't need him to watch her all the way to the door. He stayed another 2 seconds anyway, then turned and went back to the truck. His phone had 7 missed calls. 3 from a number he didn't recognize. 2 from Roy, 1 from Detective Cross, 1 from a number saved in his contacts as Mom. Florida, which meant his mother had seen something on the news and was operating at a level of concern that would require a phone call of substantial length sometime before noon. He sat in the truck outside the school and called Cross first. Cross picked up on the second ring. "Donovan, how's the cheek?" "Purple." "I've seen the security footage from last night." A pause in which something that wasn't quite humor moved through the detective's voice. "I've been doing this job for 23 years. I want you to know that what I watched on that footage. Job for 23 years. I want you to know that what I watched on that footage. The sequencing, the decision-making, the control. I've worked with SWAT guys who wouldn't have..." He stopped himself. "That's not why I called. I called because we're going to need you to come in this morning for a formal follow-up. Not a long session. We have the written statement, we have the footage, we have the drive. We just need you on record formally in the daylight, when everybody's had some sleep." "What time?" 10, if that works. Commercial Crimes Unit, 3rd floor of the Central Precinct. You know where that is?" "I can find it." "Good." Cross paused again. "Donovan, Vincent Mara gave us Drexler last night. Full cooperation, names, dates, financial transfers, the structure of the 2 shell companies. The U.S. Attorney's Office was briefed at 6 this morning. Drexler's going to have a difficult week." He said it with the flat satisfaction of someone who'd been building towards something for a long time and had just watched it arrive. "I wanted you to know that because you made it possible. The drive you pulled from that rack had a tracking algorithm on it that would have obscured the origin of the transfer. Without the physical device, Mara could have argued the data access was remote, unauthorized by his clients, not attributable. With the device, the chain of custody is clean." Caleb looked at the school entrance. 2 kids were running to the door, late, their backpacks bouncing. "I didn't know about the tracking algorithm." "No, but you pulled it anyway." "It was stolen property." "Yes, it was." Cross let that sit. 10 o'clock. "I'll see you then." He ended the call and sat another moment. Then he called Roy. Roy answered immediately. "You doing okay? For real, not the tough guy answer." "For real, I'm okay. Cheek's banged up. I need a few days off the night shift." "You're taking a week," Roy said. "I already put it in. HR approved it at 7 this morning when I told them what happened, which, for the record, took me about 45 seconds to explain before the HR coordinator said, 'Approved, done, anything else he needs.' So you've got a week, paid, categorized as critical incident recovery." Caleb hadn't expected that. He absorbed it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. The building has you on security footage defeating 5 armed professionals. HR would have given you a month." Roy's voice shifted, still gruff, but underneath it something that was trying to communicate more than Roy usually communicated verbally. "Listen, I've worked this building for 11 years. I know a lot of guys who've come through on the cleaning crews. Good people, hard workers. But Caleb, what you did last night, I don't have... He stopped. Tried again. I'm just glad you're okay. And Emma, we're both okay. Good. A pause. The floor buffer's working great, by the way, just so you know. Caleb almost smiled. I'll note that. He ended the call. Looked at his phone, called his mother in Florida, braced himself, and spent 22 minutes reassuring her that he was physically intact, that Emma was unharmed, that he had not in fact been shot, that the television news was operating with approximately 60% accuracy as usual, and that no, he did not need her to fly up, but yes, he would call her again that evening. By the time he reached the precinct, parked, and made his way to the third floor, the bruise on his cheek had attracted approximately 11 separate reactions from strangers, ranging from concerned to impressed, which told him it was more visible than he'd accounted for when he'd looked in the mirror that morning. The formal statement took 90 minutes. A court reporter was present this time. Cross walked him through the sequence with the security footage running on a laptop. Caleb watched himself on the screen moving through the amber-lit corridor with the same detached interest he might have brought to watching someone else's training drill. The footage was strange to look at. From the outside, in the dark and the grainy high-angle view, it looked more dramatic than it had felt from the inside. From the inside, it had felt like problem-solving under time constraint. From the footage, it looked like something people might want to talk about. They were already talking about it, as it turned out. Cross showed him a screenshot from a news site before he left. A cropped still from the security footage, his face partially obscured by the camera angle and the bad lighting. Under the headline, Corporate Janitor Subdues 5 Armed Intruders at Harrington Tech Tower. Sources confirm military background. The story had run at 6 a.m. By 9:30, it had been picked up by 47 outlets, according to the sidebar metric Cross pointed to without comment. Your name isn't in it yet, Cross said. The building is sitting on identification at the request of their legal team, but that's going to last about 36 hours before somebody in the building talks. I know, Caleb said. He looked at the screenshot for a moment, at the gray uniformed figure in the dark corridor. Did you give this to the press? No. Security system has an automatic backup to a cloud server. Someone in IT found it this morning. Cross looked at him. You might want to think about how you want to handle the next 48 hours. Caleb looked at the cropped figure on the screen. He didn't particularly recognize himself, which was strange, but he recognized the corridor. He recognized the cart parked against the wall where he'd left it. He thought about Emma, who was going to come home from school and probably be told by someone, a classmate, a teacher, the parent of a classmate, that her father was on the news. I need to get to my daughter before the story does, he said. Cross nodded. Go. He picked Emma up from after school at 5:15, the same as always. She was on the front steps with her book, same as the day before. The sameness of it such a sharp contrast to the previous 40 hours that it took him a moment to fully step into it without the contrast overwhelming him. She looked up, saw his face, the bruise, which had settled from purple to a definitive dark blue-green over the course of the day, and stood up without being asked. In the truck before he started the engine, he told her, not everything, but enough. He told her that the story of what happened at the building had gotten into the news, that people were going to know about it, or start to know, and that her friends or their parents might say something, and he wanted her to hear it from him first. Emma listened with her hands in her lap and her face toward the windshield. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Are people going to bother us? She asked. Honest question. He gave her an honest answer. Probably for a while. People are interested in things like this, and then they're interested in the next thing. It'll pass. Will you have to talk to reporters? I'd rather not. But maybe. She turned to look at him directly. You're not going to want to do any of that. No. But you will if you have to. Yes. She looked at the bruise again, reached up and almost touched it, stopped just short. Does it look bad? Apparently. Ms. Ford looked at me weird today, Emma said. I think someone in the office told her. What did she say? Nothing. She just kept checking on me during reading period, like she thought I was going to fall apart. Are you? Emma looked at him. No. I know. He started the engine. I just think it's worth saying out loud sometimes. She turned back to the window. After a block, she said, "Are we going to be okay, like money and stuff?" Caleb looked at the road. It was a real question, and she deserved a real answer. "We're going to be fine," he said. And then, because she was Emma, and she would know if he was just saying it, "Better than fine, I think. Things might be different, in good ways." She absorbed this with the careful attention of someone taking in information they're going to sit with privately for a while. "Okay," she said. They drove the rest of the way home without talking, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet. What? The next morning, Caleb's name was in the story. He'd expected it. It still felt strange to see it in print. Caleb Donovan, 37, a custodial services employee and former U.S. Navy SEAL, in a sentence that ran on to describe what had happened on the 32nd floor with the compressed factual confidence of a news summary that contained the architecture of the thing without any of its weight. He read it once, set his phone face down on the kitchen counter, and made coffee. His phone ran essentially continuous for 6 hours. He answered the calls he needed to answer. His mother again, a call from the Veterans Employment Placement Service that had originally gotten him the job, a call from a number that turned out to be a news producer at a television network, which he let go to voicemail, and a call from a number that resolved, when he answered it, into the voice of Howard Park, Audrey Harrington's general counsel. "Mr. Donovan, this is Howard Park, general counsel at Harrington Technologies. I apologize for calling without advance notice." "That's all right. Ms. Harrington has asked me to reach out to you, so I'm not in a legal capacity. I want to be clear about that. The company has no exposure here, you're not party to any liability, and this isn't that kind of call. She's asked if you'd be willing to come in for a conversation, a private one, just the two of you, at your convenience." "When is she thinking?" "Whenever works for you. Tomorrow, the day after. She said to tell you there's no urgency and no agenda, her word, except that she has some things she wants to say in person and a question she wants to ask you directly." Caleb looked out the kitchen window at the parking lot. 3 news vans had been parked at the end of the block since morning. He'd pulled the living room curtains. Emma had found this mildly exciting and then gotten bored and gone to read in her room, which was the most Emma response possible. "Tomorrow," Caleb said. "Late morning. 11 o'clock? That works. I'll let her know." A pause in which Howard Park seemed to be weighing something. "Mr. Donovan, I've worked with Audrey Harrington for 7 years. I've watched her handle some difficult situations. What I watched her do in that office on Wednesday night, staying in that conversation, keeping that man talking, that took a particular kind of nerve." He paused again. "I think she knew, somewhere, that she was buying time. She just didn't know for whom." Caleb didn't say anything. "Tomorrow at 11, Howard Park said. "Thank you." He left Emma with Mrs. Abernethy in 4B, a retired schoolteacher who had 3 cats and a standing offer to watch Emma whenever Caleb needed it, in exchange for nothing, because she'd told him plainly 6 months ago that having an 8-year-old or around a few times a month kept her sharp, and drove to Harrington Technologies the next morning. The building looked different in full daylight with the memory of Wednesday night laid over it. The lobby was the same marble and glass it had always been. The security desk, the same desk, the elevator, the same elevator. But Caleb wrote it differently now. Not self-consciously, just with the awareness that the building had a before and an after in his personal geography, and he was now on the after side. The security officer at the front desk, a different one from the regular night shift, had his name on a list and sent him up without a call to confirm. 32nd floor. The executive floor at 11 on a Friday morning was populated and fully lit. The amber emergency strips invisible behind the normal overhead lighting, the glass-walled conference rooms occupied with the ordinary business of a company in the middle of a major week. People looked up when he stepped off the elevator. A few of them looked quickly back down. A few held the look longer. Not aggressive, more like the look people give to someone they've heard a specific thing about and are recalibrating the image they had before against the information they have now. He was still wearing the same work clothes. He hadn't bought anything different. He didn't own a suit, and wearing one today would have felt like putting on a costume for an audience, which wasn't something he had any interest in doing. Audrey's assistant, a young man named Derek, who Caleb had exchanged roughly 40 words with across 14 months of late-night shifts, stood up from his desk when Caleb approached and extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Mr. Donovan, Derek said, with a formality that was slightly at war with the sincerity behind it. She's ready when you are. Go ahead in. Caleb knocked on the frame of the open door. Audrey was at her desk but stood when he entered, not the professional rise of someone receiving a colleague, more the instinctive movement of someone who wanted to be on their feet for this particular conversation. She was in a dark green blazer over a white shirt, and she looked like someone who had slept better than she had the right to, given the week. The office, in daylight, was the same office he'd mopped the floors of twice a week for 14 months. The same whiteboard, now covered with new material. The Meridian merger diagrams had been partially updated, new terms flowing from the old framework. The candle on the credenza had been replaced. The papers were reorganized or perhaps just redisordered. The view through the full-height windows behind her desk was, in daylight, exactly what he'd told Emma it would be. The river was visible to the east, silver and flat in the morning light, the city arranged between them and it in the layered geometry of a place that had been building itself for a long time. "Thank you for coming," Audrey said. "You said you had a question." She almost smiled at the directness. "I do. Sit down." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair, the one positioned where she received people, though she moved around the desk herself and took the other visitor's chair beside him, rather than sitting behind the desk, which he noted and thought said something accurate about her. For a moment she just looked at him, not in a way that was uncomfortable, in the way of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say and was choosing the right entry point. "The merger with Meridian closes on Monday," she said. "Harlan Drexler is facing federal charges. His firm is in free fall. The deal is clean." She paused. "None of that happens without what you did Wednesday night. It also doesn't happen without you keeping Mara talking for 12 minutes, Caleb said. "Cross told me that was the window I needed. You held that conversation deliberately." She looked slightly surprised. "I didn't know if I was doing it deliberately or just because I couldn't think of anything else to do." "Does it matter?" She considered it. "No, I suppose not." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that you can say no and nothing changes in terms of your position here. Your job is your job, and it's not contingent on this conversation." "Okay." "I'm creating a new position," she said. "Director of Corporate Security. It's a genuine structural need. Wednesday night demonstrated that more clearly than anything I could have put in a risk assessment. We have a gap in how this company thinks about physical security, personnel security, the interface between intelligence and operations." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to run it, not as a token, not because you made headlines. Because you walked into a crisis on Wednesday night, and the first thing you did was think systemically. You secured the data. You sequenced the response. You took care of the people. In that order." She paused. "That's not a janitor's instinct. That's leadership, and it's exactly what I need in that role." Caleb looked at the window, at the river. "What are we talking about in terms of structure?" he asked. She told him. The salary figure was a number he'd last associated with a different life. Not an extravagant number, not the kind that moved people into buildings very different from the ones they came from, but the kind that made payment plans disappear, that made after-school enrichment programs an option rather than a calculation. The benefits package included full medical for Emma, which she mentioned without emphasis, as a matter of course, in the way that things become a matter of course when the person offering them has thought carefully about what the person receiving them actually needs rather than what looks generous from a distance. Flexible scheduling, built around school hours. A team to build. She'd give him the autonomy to structure it as he saw fit. A direct line to her and to Howard Park. She finished and sat back and didn't push. She'd made the offer and she was going to let it be an offer, not a pressure. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "Please. I'm not particularly interested in what happened Wednesday night becoming the story of who I am here. I did what needed doing. That's finished. If I come into this role, I come into it to do the actual work. Boards, risk frameworks, physical security protocols, staff training, not as the guy who made the news. That's exactly what I want," Audrey said. "The news cycle will run for another week, and then it'll be on to something else. The security gap in this company is going to be here until someone addresses it properly." She met his eyes. "I don't need a symbol. I need someone who knows what they're doing. I'll need to restructure the third-party security vendor contracts. They're overpriced for what they're providing. I've been told the same thing and haven't had anyone with the expertise to evaluate it. That's yours. I'll need access to the building's infrastructure reports, all of them, including the IT security logs. Done. And I want the supply closets on the executive floor relabeled. The current labeling system is confusing and in an actual emergency that costs time. There was a pause. Then Audrey said, "The supply closets." "Yes. You're negotiating the supply closet labeling system. It's a legitimate operational concern." She looked at him for a moment, then she laughed. The same laugh as the corridor outside the security office, the one that came without warning and meant she'd been caught off guard by something that was better than she expected. "Fine," she said. "The supply closets are yours." He looked at the window again. The river. The city. He thought about Emma telling him okay in the truck when he'd said things might be different in good ways. The careful trust of that single word. "I'll take the position," he said. Audrey exhaled. Not dramatically, just the small release of someone who has been carrying the outcome of something and has just set it down. "Good." She stood, and he stood. She offered her hand, and he shook it. "When can you start?" "Monday. That's the day the merger closes." "I know," he said. "Good timing." She walked him to the office door. Derek looked up from his desk with an expression that suggested he'd been following the energy of the conversation through the walls and had reached a reasonably accurate conclusion about the outcome. Caleb nodded to him on the way past. At the elevator, he pressed the call button and waited. He could feel the eyes of the floor on him. Not hostile, not intrusive, just the awareness of a room tracking something it was still making sense of. He was used to not being tracked. He was going to have to adjust to this. The elevator arrived. He stepped in and turned around. Audrey was standing in her office doorway. She gave him a small nod, the kind that's too controlled to be casual but too understated to be ceremonial. He returned it. The doors closed. He rode down alone. The lobby was busy with the midday flow of employees and visitors. The security desk officer nodded to him as he passed. He went through the revolving door and out into the morning, brighter now, the cloud cover having thinned enough to let some actual sunlight through for the first time in days. The news vans were gone from the block. The story had either been downgraded or they'd moved to something fresher. He walked to his truck, sat in it for a moment. He called Mrs. Abernethy in 4B. She picked up on the second ring, sounding slightly breathless, which meant she and Emma had been doing something that involved moving around. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Different." "Good different?" He looked at the building in the rearview mirror, the 32 floors of it, the glass catching the thin late morning sun. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Emma's fine, just so you know. We made soup." "What kind?" "She picked tomato. She always picks tomato." "I know," Caleb said. "Tell her I'm on my way." He pulled out of the parking space and merged into the midday traffic, heading north toward the apartment, toward the soup, toward the particular ordinary brightness of a Friday afternoon when the hard part of the week is done and you have a couple of days ahead of you that aren't spoken for yet. His shoulder felt better today. The barometric pressure was holding. The cheek still hurt, but less. He drove with both hands on the wheel and thought about Monday. About walking into the building not through the service entrance, not with the cart and the cleaning supplies, but through the front door. About what that would feel like in his body the first time. About how it would feel the 5th time and the 20th, when it had become the new ordinary. He suspected it would take longer to feel normal than most people would expect. He also suspected that was fine. Most things worth changing took longer than you expected and arrived less smoothly than you hoped and mattered more than you'd originally accounted for. He turned onto his street and found a parking spot 2 buildings down from his own, which at this hour on a Friday was a minor logistical victory of the kind that felt disproportionately good after a week like this one. He sat in the truck for another moment before going up. There was a text from Detective Cross. "Drexler turned himself in at 9 this morning. Attorney's in tow, but he's in. Good week." And below it, from a number he didn't have saved, a single line, "Monday. I'll have someone meet you at the front desk. A.H." He put his phone in his jacket pocket and got out of the truck. The sun was doing something real now, cutting through the remaining cloud cover at an angle that made the wet pavement shine in a way that was nothing special. And also, on this particular Friday morning felt like more than nothing. He walked up the block, went in through the lobby of his building, took the stairs to the 4th floor, knocked on 4B. The door opened. Emma looked at his face, at the bruise, which she'd clearly decided to stop commenting on because she'd cataloged it, and moved on, and then passed him into the corridor the way she did when she was checking that everything was as it should be before she fully registered that he was back. "You were gone a long time," she said. "I know. Sorry." He stepped inside. The apartment smelled like tomato soup. Mrs. Abernethy was in the kitchen, moving with the relaxed confidence of someone who had made soup in many kitchens over many decades and had no concerns about the outcome. "How was your morning?" Emma looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment she'd been born with. Something in his face told her something, the way it always did, the way he'd never been able to fully manage or prevent. Her expression shifted, not to worry, but to the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. "What happened?" she asked. He sat down on the couch and looked at his daughter. "How would you feel about things being a little different?" She sat down beside him, cross-legged, with the seriousness of someone preparing to receive information they've decided in advance they're going to handle well. "Define different," she said. "New job, more money, regular hours." She processed this carefully, the way she processed everything that was offered to her as good news, with the same measured attention she gave to bad news, because she'd learned early that neither category came without nuance. "Doing what?" "Security. For the company." "Ms. Harrington's company." "Yes." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "You'd be in the same building?" "Same building, different floor." "The 32nd? "Sometimes." She looked at the window, at the light coming in, working through it. Then, "Is this because of what happened Wednesday?" "It started there," Caleb said, "but she offered it because she needs the work done. Not as a—" He searched for the right word. "Reward?" Emma offered. "Yeah." "That's better," Emma said, with a gravity that made him want to laugh and didn't because she meant it seriously. "I didn't want it to be just a reward." "Me neither." She sat with it for another moment. Then she looked at him directly, with those clear eyes that were her mother's eyes, and also entirely her own. "Are you happy about it?" He thought about the honest answer. Not the performed version, not the reassuring version, but the actual ground-level truth of how he felt sitting here in this apartment on a Friday morning after the week they'd just had. He thought about the river visible from the 32nd floor. He thought about the supply closets and the floor buffer belt and Roy's text at 4 a.m. He thought about Emma at 8 years old sitting in a supply closet for 12 minutes and coming out holding her math worksheet. "I think I'm going to be," he said. Emma nodded once. That was enough. She stood up and went to check on the soup. Monday arrived the way significant days often do, indistinguishable from any other morning in the first moments after the alarm, ordinary in all the small physical details, only revealing its weight once you were already inside it. Caleb was up at 6. He showered, made coffee, stood at the kitchen counter in the quiet, before Emma woke up and looked at the city coming into its morning through the window. The light was doing the slow work of arriving, gray first, then the particular pale gold that precedes full daylight, spreading from east to west across the rooftops and the wet streets below. His shoulder wasn't bothering him. The cheek had faded from blue-green to yellow at the margins, still visible if you were looking, not the first thing you noticed anymore. He'd spent the weekend doing practical things. He'd gone through his closet and identified 3 collared shirts that were in acceptable condition, 2 pairs of dark trousers, and a jacket he'd bought for a veterans function 2 years ago that still fit. He'd had Emma evaluate the combinations with the seriousness she brought to all aesthetic judgments, and she'd selected the dark gray trousers with a navy shirt and the jacket, which she'd described as looking like someone who was good at their job without trying to look like they were good at their job. He'd accepted this assessment without argument. He'd also made 2 phone calls over the weekend that needed to be made. The first was to Memorial Hospital's billing department, where he'd spoken to a representative named Carol who had been handling his payment plan account for 8 months. He told her that his financial situation had changed and that he wanted to discuss accelerating the payoff schedule. Carol had made a sound that was part professional and part something more human, the sound of someone who handles a lot of difficult calls and knows the difference between someone's situation getting worse and someone's situation getting better, and responding to the latter with the particular warmth that that particular direction of change deserves. The second call had been to Emma's school, where he'd spoken to the office coordinator about the enrichment program that Ms. Ford had mentioned at the parent-teacher conference. The program was $310 a month. He enrolled her on the phone, gave the card information, and then sat for a moment after he ended the call in the specific quiet of someone who has just removed a weight they've been carrying so long that the absence of it feels strange. He'd told Emma about the program at dinner Saturday. She'd looked at him with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. The after-school one? She asked. The one with the robotics? And the advanced math? And the writing lab? You said it was expensive. It was, he said. Things are different now. She looked at her plate, then back at him. Okay, she said, in the quiet, serious way that meant she understood more of the full picture than he'd explicitly explained. Thank you, Dad. He'd nodded, and they'd eaten the rest of dinner with the television on low in the other room, which was a Friday night habit they'd developed without deciding to, the way most habits develop. Now it was Monday morning, and the coffee was strong, and Emma came out of her room at 6:40 in her school clothes, her hair still slightly disordered from sleep, carrying her backpack by one strap. She poured herself cereal without being asked, sat at the counter, and looked at him in his navy shirt and dark trousers and the jacket hanging on the back of the chair. You look different, she said. Different good or different bad? She considered it, eating cereal. Different right, she said finally, which was Emma's way of saying something was where it was supposed to be. He dropped her at school at 7:50. She went through the door without looking back, same as always. The unself-conscious confidence of a kid who trusted that the person she was leaving behind would be there at the end of the day. He sat in the truck for a moment after she went in, watching the door. Then he pulled out and headed toward the building. The drive took 22 minutes. He parked in the visitor lot. His permanent parking assignment in the employee structure wouldn't be activated until later in the week, according to Derek, who had sent him a welcome email on Friday afternoon that had been thorough and slightly formal and ended with a hand-typed line that said, "For what it's worth, everyone up here is glad you're staying in the building." He'd read it twice. The lobby of Harrington Technologies on a Monday morning was a different world from the lobby at 11:45 on a Wednesday night. It was full, the particular productive flow of a large organization starting its week, people crossing in the specific patterns of those who know exactly where they're going and are already thinking about what happens when they get there. The marble floor was the same marble floor. The security desk was the same security desk. The officer there, a man named Gerald, who had worked the morning desk for 4 years and with whom Caleb had exchanged maybe 6 complete sentences across 14 months of early arrivals, looked up when he came through the revolving door, looked at him for a moment in a way that recalibrated the category he'd been stored under for the past year. Then Gerald stood up, straightened slightly, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Donovan." Caleb stopped at the desk. "Gerald," he said. "It's still Caleb. That's not changing." Gerald looked slightly uncertain, then settled into something more comfortable. "Good morning, Caleb. Ms. Harrington's assistant said to send you up when you arrived. Elevator's clear." "Thank you." He crossed the lobby. He was aware of people in his peripheral vision registering his passage. Not every person, not dramatically, but the specific awareness that moves through a room when someone enters it who has recently been in the news and is now wearing different clothes in a familiar context. He kept his pace even and his eyes forward, the way he'd walked through every operational environment he'd ever worked in, present, purposeful, not performing presence or purpose. The elevator to the 32nd floor opened when he pressed the button and closed behind him when he stepped in. He rode it alone. When the doors opened, Derek was already on his feet, coming around from behind his desk with the energy of someone who had been watching the elevator indicator. He shook Caleb's hand again, the same hand that had been extended on Friday, with the same mixture of formality and sincerity. "She's finishing a call," Derek said. 5 minutes. "Can I get you coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." He waited in the small seating area outside Audrey's office that he had pushed a vacuum cleaner past approximately 60 times without ever sitting in. He sat in it now. It was a good chair, the kind of furniture that communicated through its quality that the company was doing well. He'd never noticed that before from this angle. From the cleaning side of it, he'd noticed whether the upholstery needed spot treatment. From the sitting side of it, He noticed everything else. He looked at the floor. It was clean. Roy's night crew was good. The office door opened and Audrey appeared in it, off the phone. She looked at him in the chair and the same recalibrating look crossed her face that had crossed Gerald's, the adjustment of an established image to new information, done quickly and without performance. "Caleb." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." The office was the same office. The view was the same view, but she'd cleared the small round table in the corner, the one that normally held overflow files and the occasional plant she forgot to water, and set it with 2 chairs facing each other. It wasn't a desk meeting. He noted that. He sat. She sat across from him. "How was the weekend?" she asked. "Quiet. Good." He looked at her. "Merger closed?" 2 hours ago." She said it with the flatness of someone who'd been waiting for a thing long enough that its arrival felt more like exhaling than celebrating. "The Meridian board signed at 8:15. Howard called me on the drive in." She paused. "Harlan Drexler's legal team has been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office since Friday. They're negotiating the terms of his cooperation. He's going to give them everyone in the chain in exchange for a reduced charge, which means the people who actually commissioned the operation are going to be named. Cross told me to expect that. He told me the same." She looked at her hands briefly. "I keep thinking about the fact that Drexler would have gotten what he wanted. If you hadn't been in the building, if you'd been on a different floor, or already finished, or gone home early." She looked up. "The margin was that thin." "Margins usually are," Caleb said. "I know, I just—" She stopped, started differently. "I've been running this company for 18 months. I know what the risk assessments say. I know what the security vendor reports say. I know what the consultants recommend and what we implement and what we defer to the next quarter. I thought I understood the gap between the plan and the actual situation." She looked at him. "Wednesday showed me I didn't." "That's why the role exists," Caleb said. "Yes." She looked at the window, at the river, visible and flat in the morning light. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to know I thought carefully about whether it's appropriate to say, and I decided it was, because I think not saying it would be the kind of omission that sits between people and doesn't improve anything." She looked back at him. "When I first came into this role, I inherited an HR philosophy from my father that I accepted without examining it as closely as I should have. He built this company on talent, on finding the best technical people and compensating them extremely well, and building a culture that rewarded expertise and performance. That was right. It worked. But somewhere in that philosophy, the people who made the building run, the cleaning crews, the maintenance staff, the security officers on the desk, they became infrastructure rather than people." She said it without softening it, not through malice, through the specific carelessness of a company that was very good at valuing certain kinds of contribution and genuinely blind to others. Caleb listened. "I knew your name for 2 weeks before Wednesday night," she said. "I'd worked in this building for 4 years. You'd been here for 14 months. She paused. "That's not acceptable." "I wasn't looking for recognition," Caleb said. "I know, that's not the point." She leaned forward slightly. "The point is that it shouldn't require someone doing what you did for the people who keep this place running to be seen as people. That's a failure of culture, not just of management. And I'm the CEO. That's mine to fix." He looked at her, at the particular quality of someone who had thought themselves around a hard corner and had come out the other side with a position they actually held rather than one they were performing. "What does fixing it look like?" he asked. "I'm working on that. I have some ideas. I'd like your input on them, actually. Not as the security director, but as someone who spent 14 months on the other side of the glass." "I'll tell you what I saw," he said. Honestly, not tactfully. I'd expect nothing else at this point. She allowed herself a small expression that was almost dry and almost warm at the same time, and the combination of those two things was what Audrey Harrington looked like when she was being real rather than executive. He was learning the difference. "Should we talk about your first week?" "Let's talk about the third-party security contracts," he said. "I looked at the vendor summaries you had Derek send me Friday. There's a gap in the monitoring coverage on floors 12 through 19 during the shift handover between 8 and 9 p.m. It's not in any of the assessments because no one modeled the handover timing against the access log data." She looked at him. "You identified that from the summaries over a weekend." It took about 40 minutes. The vendor has had those contracts for 3 years. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for the notepad on the table and uncapped a pen. Okay, she said. Walk me through it. He did. They worked through it for 90 minutes. The security contracts, the infrastructure monitoring gaps, the access control protocols that had been written for the building's original configuration and never updated when 2 floors were renovated. He told her what needed immediate attention and what could be phased. He told her that the night security staff were undertrained in the specific ways that mattered, not in procedure, but in observation, in reading the difference between a normal deviation and a significant one. He told her that the supply closet labeling system on floors 28 through 33 was creating 3 to 5 minute delays in emergency access, which at certain hours could be material. She wrote steadily and asked good questions and didn't push back on anything he said without a genuine reason for doing so, which was the best kind of working dynamic. And also, he was learning exactly how she operated when she trusted the person she was working with. At noon, Derek knocked on the open door. Lunch is here if you want it. I ordered from the place on Commerce. I guessed on your order, Caleb, so if I got it wrong, let me know. It turned out Derek had ordered him a turkey sandwich on wheat with no mayonnaise, which was accurate in a way that suggested Derek was either perceptive or had asked Roy, and Caleb wasn't sure which but respected both possibilities. They ate at the round table with the files between them and the city spread out behind the windows and the particular ease of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to keep establishing it. Can I ask you something? Audrey said. Sure. Your wife. She said it carefully, not intrusively. Derek told me, I asked him, I should say, I didn't ask him to go looking 2 years ago. Yes. I'm sorry. He looked at the sandwich. Thank you. Emma doesn't talk about her? She does sometimes. She talks about her the way you talk about someone who was real and mattered, not the way you talk about a subject. He paused. She remembers specific things, the way she smelled, a song she used to sing off-key in the car, the particular way she organized the bookshelf. Emma remembers the actual person rather than the idea of her, which I think is important. Audrey was quiet for a moment. You're raising her to do that deliberately. I'm trying, he said. I'm not always sure I'm doing it right. You sent her to school this morning, Audrey said. After everything this past week, she went in and did her day. She always does. She gets that from somewhere. He looked at the window, at the light on the river. She gets it from herself, he said. I just try not to get in the way. Audrey smiled at that. Something real in it, something that didn't have any professional context attached. She came into my office and asked me about fractions, she said. Walked in like she owned the place. She's been raised to believe she belongs wherever she is. That's exactly the right way to raise someone. He looked at her. You should see about a school liaison program. Harrington Technologies has the resources. Skilled employees who could volunteer for tutoring or enrichment sessions at schools in the district. It wouldn't cost much, and the return in terms of community relationship and employee engagement is significant. Audrey looked at him for a moment. We've been talking about security contracts, and you just pivoted to community education. It was in the same thought. She uncapped her pen again. Tell me more. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple or the kind of transformation that happens in montages. Real change in a large organization is slow and resistant and frequently circular. You address one thing and uncover 2 more beneath it. You build a structure and find the foundation of it needs adjustment. You have weeks where nothing seems to be moving and then a Tuesday where 4 things resolve at once. Caleb had expected that. He'd been in enough complex environments to know that the romanticized version of institutional change, the sudden awakening, the company-wide transformation, the moment where everyone collectively decides to do better, was a story people told afterward rather than an experience they had in real time. In real time, it was individual conversations and specific decisions and the long, unglamorous work of building systems that held. His first hire was a former Army intelligence analyst named Patricia Osei, who had been working contract security for a hotel chain and had, according to her resume, a particular gift for threat pattern recognition. He interviewed her in the small conference room on 32, the same one the intruders had entered on the night of the power cut. He found that the room carried no specific weight for him. It was a room. He'd decided that on his first week back. Patricia Osei sat across from him and answered his questions with the directness of someone who had been in institutional environments long enough to know that directness saves everyone time. She was 41, precise, with a habit of pausing before she answered difficult questions that was not hesitation but processing. He made her an offer at the end of the interview. She accepted it and started the following week. His second hire was the former head of physical security for a regional airport who brought with him specific expertise in access control and a personality that was somewhere between a boulder and a fire hydrant, immovable and capable of redirecting significant force. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was exactly what the building's security culture needed, in the specific way that a building's security culture needs someone who will not let a thing pass because it is inconvenient to address. Together, the three of them spent 4 weeks rebuilding the operational framework from the access logs up. They renegotiated the vendor contracts. Caleb had been right about the monitoring gap on floors 12 through 19, and the correction of it revealed 2 additional gaps that hadn't been in any assessment. They rewrote the shift handover protocol. They updated the emergency access labeling on 8 floors, which took a Saturday and a Sunday and a significant quantity of industrial labeling tape, and which Roy oversaw with the air of a man watching something he'd wanted to happen for a long time finally happening. Roy had been named as a reference in Caleb's formal company file. He'd done it without asking Roy first, and Roy had found out when HR called him. He'd texted Caleb one line, "You owe me a beer," to which Caleb had responded, "Name the place," to which Roy had sent the name of a bar 3 blocks from the building where they had, in fact, had a beer the following Friday, and where Roy had talked about his kids and Caleb had talked about Emma, and they'd split a plate of wings and watched part of a game neither of them was particularly invested in, which was the best kind of social obligation, the kind that turns out not to be an obligation. Audrey launched the community engagement program in the 3rd month. It started small. 12 employees volunteering for 2 hours a week at 4 neighborhood schools, coordinated by an internal committee that included, at Caleb's suggestion, representatives from the facilities and maintenance teams as well as the executive floors. Emma's school was one of the 4. Ms. Ford had sent Caleb a note, a physical note, handwritten, which he'd kept, expressing what she called her genuine surprise at the quality of the program and her specific appreciation for the robotics sessions, which Emma had apparently been dominating with a focus that Ms. Ford described as somewhat intimidating for the other students. He'd shown Emma the note. She'd read it with a carefully neutral expression. "I'm not trying to be intimidating," she said. "I'm trying to finish the project." "I know," he said. "Some people experience those as the same thing." She'd looked at him. "Is that a problem?" "Not if you're aware of it." She'd folded the note and handed it back. "I'll be aware of it," she said. Which was Emma for, "I'll keep doing what I'm doing, but I understand the social dynamic." The Harlan Drexler case resolved in month 4. He accepted a plea agreement, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, 3 additional related charges, that included a substantial financial penalty and a prohibition on holding executive or board-level positions at publicly traded companies for 15 years. The press coverage was significant for about a week and then moved on, the way press coverage does, toward the next available story. Vincent Mara received a separate agreement with harsher terms, because cooperation only gets you so far when the underlying conduct is documented as thoroughly as his was. Detective Cross called Caleb when the agreement was finalized. They talked for about 10 minutes. Cross gave him the details. Caleb listened. They agreed it was the appropriate outcome given the constraints of what the system could do with what it had been given. Before he hung up, Cross said, "I want you to know that the IT forensics team confirmed what you suspected. The tracking algorithm on that drive would have made attribution almost impossible. The data that was queued for transfer was enough to tank the Meridian deal. If it had completed," he paused. "You made a decision in a dark corridor in 12 seconds that had consequences you couldn't have calculated at the time." "I wasn't calculating consequences," Caleb said. "I was solving the immediate problem." "I know," Cross said. "That's why it worked." He ended the call and sat for a moment at his desk. His desk, which was a real desk in a real office on the 29th floor, a deliberate 3 floors below the executive suite because he'd wanted the physical separation that said his function was not about proximity to power, but about the actual work. The office had a window that faced west, away from the river, toward the denser part of the city where the buildings stepped down toward the older neighborhoods. He liked that view. It felt more honest than the river view from the 32nd floor, which was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're designed to be seen. He thought about what Cross had said, about the 12-second decision in the dark. I thought about the fact that most of the things that had changed his life, the decision to enlist, the decision to stay in for an 11th year, the decision to take the cleaning job when the alternatives dried up, the decision to move toward Audrey's office door rather than away from it, none of them had felt like significant decisions from the inside. They'd felt like the next available thing to do. The weight of them was only visible in retrospect, from a sufficient distance, when you could look back and see the line they'd drawn through everything that came after. He thought about Emma, about what it meant to have raised her, for 2 years now, alone. Not elegantly. There had been bad mornings and worse evenings, and school pickups he'd been late for, and conversations he'd handled wrong, and apologies he'd had to give to an 8-year-old who had every right to the apology and every capacity to receive it without using it against him. He thought about the fact that Emma went to sleep every night in an apartment with a roof that he paid for, and woke up every morning and went to school and came home and did her homework, and thought about fractions and robotics and the organizational logic of library shelving systems, and that this was not a small thing. It was not a dramatic thing either. But not everything true is dramatic, and not everything important is visible. This was the thing he'd come to understand, not as a conclusion he'd reached once and held on to, but as something he kept relearning in different forms, the way certain lessons have to be relearned because the mind keeps trying to simplify them into something that can be filed and left alone. The truth was that the most important things he'd done in his life were also the least impressive from the outside. Showing up consistently, telling his daughter the truth about difficult things in language she could actually hold, fixing the floor buffer with a $26 belt because it needed to be fixed, and he knew how to fix it, staying in the building on a Wednesday night when the rational option was to wait for someone else. He was not a symbol. He had no interest in being one. The news cycle had moved through him like weather, present, temporarily significant, then gone. And what it had left behind was this: a desk, a window facing west, 2 people who worked for him and were good at their work, a renegotiated vendor contract, a corrected monitoring gap on floors 12 through 19, and a daughter who is currently, according to her last school report, running her robotics team's design process with a focus that Ms. Ford had upgraded from intimidating to inspiring, which Caleb had noted as progress. He had not become a different person. He was the same person in a different position, which was the only honest version of change, the kind that doesn't require you to reinvent your history, but only to move through it towards something you can actually use. 6 months after the night the power went out on the 32nd floor, Audrey called an all-staff meeting. Not a department meeting or an executive briefing, an actual all-staff assembly. The full population of the building gathered in the atrium on the ground floor, which held everyone only if you were willing to accept that some people would be on the mezzanine rail and some would be in the adjacent corridor looking through the glass partition. Caleb stood near the back of the main atrium with Marcus Webb, who was tracking the crowd the way Marcus tracked all crowds, systematically, quietly, with the professional attention of someone who did not stop working because the context became social. Patricia was on the mezzanine. They'd covered the space without discussing it. Old habits. Audrey stood at the front of the atrium on the low riser that the building used for events, without a podium, with a microphone she was holding rather than clipping, in the way of someone who wanted to be visibly present in the room rather than behind equipment. She talked for about 20 minutes. She talked about the previous 6 months, about the Meridian merger and what it meant for the company's direction, about the security improvements and what they'd exposed about gaps in institutional thinking, about the community program and the schools and the specific robotics project at one of the partner schools that had won a district competition. She didn't name Emma, but she looked briefly in Caleb's direction when she mentioned it, and 3 people near him noticed and looked over, which he ignored. Then she said something that the room was not entirely expecting. She said, "I want to talk about something that's harder to quantify than a merger or a security protocol. 6 months ago, a man who worked in this building for 14 months was nearly unknown to the people around him. He cleaned these floors, rode the service elevator, signed in and out at the facilities desk, and was functionally invisible to most of the company he was keeping safe just by being present and paying attention." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you that what happened the night of the breach was the important part of his story. It was the most dramatic part. But the important part was the 14 months before it, when he showed up, every shift, and did the work that needed doing, and raised his daughter, and fixed things that were broken, and noticed things that other people walked past. Another pause. We built this company on the idea that excellence deserves recognition. I think we built it with too narrow a definition of both words. The atrium was quiet in the particular way of a large group of people who are actually listening rather than waiting to stop listening. The people who clean this building, Audrey said, the people on the security desk, the people in facilities, the maintenance crews, they are not background. They are not infrastructure. They are people doing skilled work that this company could not function without, and they deserve to be seen and treated as exactly that. She looked across the room. I've been told that it takes a crisis to change a culture. I don't think that's true. I think it takes someone being willing to say clearly what the problem is and then doing the work, the actual unglamorous long-term work, to fix it. We're in the middle of that work. We're going to stay in the middle of it for as long as it takes. She lowered the microphone slightly. That's all I wanted to say. The room applauded. Not the polite, obligatory kind. The kind that builds from a few people starting and then becomes the room, deciding that this is the appropriate response to something that was said honestly. Caleb stood near the back and didn't applaud. He had his hands in his pockets, and he watched the room respond to the woman at the front of it, and he thought about what it meant to say a true thing in a large room and then be accountable for it. That was the harder part. Anyone could give a speech. The question was what the next 6 months looked like, and the 6 months after that, and whether the words were the beginning of the work or a replacement for it. He thought they were the beginning. He'd been watching for 6 months, and he thought they were the beginning. After the meeting, people filtered back to their floors in the particular flow of a large group dispersing, organized on the surface, slightly chaotic underneath, human in all the ways that large groups are human when the formality relaxes. Several people stopped to speak to Caleb on their way past. The facilities coordinator, a woman named Sandra who had worked the building for 9 years, stopped and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately place and then could. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a thing to be named and had just heard it named. About time, she said. Yeah, he said. She nodded and kept walking. Roy found him near the elevator bank. Roy was wearing his Good Facilities shirt, the one he wore for company events, and carrying a coffee cup and looking like a man who had just heard something he wanted to hear without expecting to hear it. He stood next to Caleb and they watched the atrium empty for a moment. She meant it, Roy said. I know. How do you know? Because she said the things that were hard to say instead of the things that would have been easier. Caleb looked at the front of the atrium where Audrey was speaking to a cluster of employees from the IT department. The easy speech was about the merger and the security improvements and looking forward. She gave the harder one. Roy drank his coffee. When do they want us to start on the 12th floor access corridor retrofit? Next week. I'll send you the spec sheet tonight. Will the labeling system be the same as we did on 28? Yes. Good. That one worked. They stood for another moment in the way of two people who have reached the point in a friendship where silence is not uncomfortable and doesn't need to be filled. Beer Friday? Roy said. Yeah, Caleb said. Friday. He picked Emma up from her enrichment program at 5:15, which was the new regular time, the logistics of their lives having rearranged themselves around the new schedule, in the way lives rearrange when the constraints change. She came out of the school building carrying a model, something structural, laser-cut wood, and small metal fasteners, about the size of a shoebox, with the focused care of someone transporting something fragile that they built themselves. He got the truck door for her. She set the model on the back seat with the seriousness of someone securing a piece of equipment. What is it? He asked. A load-bearing frame test, she said. For the competition, we're testing which configuration holds the most weight per unit of material. He looked at it through the window. Which configuration won? Mine, she said without inflection, just the fact. He started the truck. How do you know? Because I tested all 6 before I built the final one. She buckled her seatbelt. The other kids built one and hoped. He pulled out of the school parking lot. The afternoon was clear, saw proper autumn now, the kind of day that has actual weight to the air, the light coming in at the lower angle that made everything look slightly more itself. He drove north toward the apartment through the familiar geography of a city that felt After 6 months, like a city he'd chosen, rather than a city he'd landed in. "How was your day?" Emma asked. "Good." Audrey spoke at an all-staff meeting. "What about?" He thought about how to answer that with appropriate accuracy. About how companies miss important things when they decide some people matter more than others. Emma was quiet for a moment. "That's obvious." "Some things are obvious and still need to be said." She looked out the window at the passing buildings, the people on the sidewalks, the specific late afternoon light on everything. "Did people listen?" "I think so." "Good." She turned back to the front. "Did you eat lunch today?" "Yes." "What did you have?" "Turkey sandwich." "Derek again?" "Derek again." She nodded as if this confirmed a hypothesis. "He's consistent." "He is." They drove the rest of the way home without talking, which was their road language. The shorthand of two people who had spent a lot of time in the same truck and had learned that silence was not a gap to be filled, but a medium to exist in comfortably. Emma had her book out by the time they hit the bridge, reading in the fading light the way she always did, her feet up on the dashboard in a way he'd told her not to do approximately 40 times, and had stopped mentioning because some battles are not the battles. He drove and watched the road and thought about the evening ahead. Dinner to make, a spec sheet to finalize, an email to Patricia about the vendor review scheduled for Thursday. Emma had homework and probably wanted to show him something about the load-bearing frame test. He'd look at it. He'd ask questions about the material configuration, and she'd explain it with the patience she reserved for things she actually wanted to explain, which was different from the patience she deployed when she was being polite. These were the evenings. Not the dramatic ones. Not the ones that made the news or changed the company or ended with sirens in the street. The ordinary ones, which were the real structure of a life. The load-bearing frame, if he was going to stay in Emma's architectural vocabulary. The configuration that held the most weight per unit of material. He thought about his wife, about the Summer Lake photograph on the kitchen counter. He still looked at it most mornings, not with the specific grief of the early years, but with the particular acknowledgement of someone keeping a person present in a life that had moved on without them, which was the honest thing to do and also, some days, the hard thing. She would have liked this version of things, he thought, not because it was better. It wasn't better, it was just forward. And forward wasn't a direction she'd gotten, but she would have liked watching Emma explain the load-bearing frame test. She would have liked watching him eat Derek's turkey sandwich at a desk in a building he'd once mopped at midnight. She would have laughed about the supply closet labeling system, which was a detail he hadn't told many people, but which he thought she would have found specifically funny. He told Emma the supply closet story on a Saturday morning over breakfast. Emma had listened, and when he finished, she'd said, "So the first thing you asked for was to fix the labels on the closets?" "Yes." "Before the salary?" "I mentioned the salary, then I mentioned the closets." Emma had looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd said very seriously, "That's very you," and gone back to her cereal. And that was the fullest endorsement he'd received from anyone in the entire process, and he knew it. He turned into the apartment complex, parked. Emma was already bookmarking her page before he pulled the key. He got out. Got her door. She carried the load-bearing frame out with both hands, navigating the parking lot with the deliberate care of someone who has decided that this object will survive the transit, regardless of the effort required. He carried her backpack. They went up the stairs together, him 2 steps behind her in case she needed to hand him the frame, which she didn't, because she was Emma and she'd already calculated the exact grip required to make the trip safely. He got the door open. The apartment smelled like the afternoon, like nothing specific, like the particular ambient warmth of a place that has been lived in consistently by the same people long enough to carry their specific atmosphere. Emma set the frame on the kitchen table with the care of someone placing something earned. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she looked at him. "What do you want for dinner?" she asked. He looked at his daughter standing in the kitchen light with her school clothes and her book in her jacket pocket, and her load-bearing frame on the table, 8 years old and more herself than most people managed to be at any age, and he thought about the fact that this was the thing, this specific ordinary moment, this question about dinner on a Monday evening, that all the other things had been protecting, not the merger, not the company, not the headline or the security contracts or the speech in the atrium, this. "What do you want?" he said. She considered it with genuine seriousness. "Pasta," she said. "The kind with the tomato." "Okay." And can we watch something after? Not news. Not news, he agreed. Your pick. She seemed satisfied with this arrangement. She pulled the book back out of her jacket and went to the couch. He went to the kitchen and started the water for the pasta and got the sauce from the cabinet and stood at the stove while the city settled into its evening outside the windows. There was a version of this story that was about heroism, about the dramatic night and the 5 men in the corridor and the drive pulled from the server rack and the name in the newspapers. That version wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete in the way all dramatic versions are incomplete. They catch the moment of maximum tension and miss the 10,000 ordinary moments that made the person capable of it. What made Caleb Donovan capable of what he did on a Wednesday night was not his training, though the training was real. It was not his instincts, though the instincts held. It was 14 months of showing up, of doing the work that was in front of him without waiting for work that was more suited to his self-image, of learning a building and its people and its rhythms, not because he was preparing for anything, but because that was who he was. A person who paid attention, who fixed what was broken within his reach, who told his daughter the truth about difficult things, who set his alarm for 5:15 and answered it every morning. The extraordinary moment came from the ordinary life. It always does. The people who perform well in crises are rarely people who have been training for crises. They are people who have been training, invisibly, every day, by simply being the kind of person they are. This was what Caleb understood and what he would never say in a speech, because it wasn't the kind of thing that translated well into a speech. It was only legible in the living of it, in the floor buffer belt and the hospital payment plan and the parent-teacher conference and the apple juice that Emma had been thinking about since the break room vending machine let her down. In the supply closet labels, in Derek's turkey sandwich, in Roy's beer on Friday, in a daughter on a couch with a book, in pasta with the tomato kind of sauce, in a Monday evening at the end of a long road, which was not the end of anything, only a place to stand and look back at where you'd come from, and forward at what was still ahead, and understand that both directions contained more than you could see from any single point, and that this was not a problem, but a description of a life being lived with its full, uncertain length still in front of it. He stirred the sauce. Emma turned a page. Outside, the city did what cities do. It kept going, indifferent and immense, and full of people doing the invisible work of their lives in apartments and offices and service corridors, noticed by some, missed by many,